Calistos, Guardians of Hades Romance Series, Book 5. Written by Felicity Heaton. Narrated by Eric G. Dove. Chapter 26.
What are you doing?
Cass came up behind Diamond where he crouched in the corner of the garden beneath an ancient twisted cherry tree. His shoulders tensed beneath his dark navy roll-neck long-sleeved top, and he tilted his head and glowered over his left one at her. She had that effect on people. "Nothing," he muttered, and was swift to stand and keep moving. Cass canted her head, casually brushed the inky waves of her hair over her shoulder, and frowned at the spot where he had been. She took a few steps toward it, eased down, and held her hand out, hovering it above the ground. There was power there deep in the earth. The same kind of dark power she had felt in London. At the townhouse that belonged to the no-good god Miranda seemed rather infatuated with. "What are you doing?" Diamond's brusque voice invaded her perusal of the intricate web of the enchantment. His heavy black boots appeared in the corner of her vision to her left, and the sense of power he emanated wrapped around her, pulling her own to the fore as instinct demanded she protect herself. There was no need to fear him. He wasn't a threat to her. She looked at his boots and slowly lifted her gaze, meant to do it swiftly, but it became a leisurely glide up his black jeans-clad long legs, over his narrow hips, to the teasing tightness of his top as it hugged his chest and stomach. When she finally reached his face, she amended her thoughts about him. Perhaps he was a threat to her. His pale blue eyes had turned glacial, narrowed beneath the hard line of his white eyebrows, and the downward tilt of his compressed lips warned she was pushing her luck.
"Inspecting the ward, as you were."
She rose to her feet as casually as she could manage, pretending that glare he had turned on her and the shift in his powers didn't frighten her in the slightest. He huffed, pivoted on his heel, and walked away from her. Cass didn't give him a chance to escape.
"Did you make all of these wards?"
She mentally cursed him as he picked up pace, his long legs easily carrying him away from her. "No," he bit out. He wasn't a very talkative fellow, seemed rather determined to ignore her, and was clearly having as much difficulty trusting her as his brothers were, especially the black-haired one with a bad attitude. She shrugged at that, unsure which of the two with black hair was worse. Karras, who looked as if he wanted to knock her down a few pegs to make sure she knew who was the boss of this troop, or Escher, who just looked as if he wanted her 6 feet under his boots and pushing up daisies.
"Did you make some of them?"
She tugged her black dress up, hoisting it high enough that the split hit her waist and she could move easily. Diamond remained silent. She took that as a yes.
"It is rather impressive work for a god."
She halted when he suddenly stopped dead, and the air chilled a few degrees, enough that her breath fogged in front of her face. "For a god," he muttered, his tone telling her he had taken her choice of words as an insult. "Like we're dirt beneath the feet of a witch, creatures that shouldn't be capable of such a feat. You need a reminder that you're at the mercy of gods?"
"I didn't mean it like that."
She took a step towards him, the stepping stones that formed the path freezing cold beneath her bare feet. She risked a glance at his boots. Frost glittered on them, spreading to form delicate and beautiful patterns on the black leather and across the stones beneath them. Frustration rolled through her, and not for the first time since she had been teleported to this place. Miranda's words echoed in her head, her darling ward's warning that she had to play nice at the forefront of her mind. She didn't want Miranda or these gods to be angry with her. "So you meant it like what?" He turned on her and froze, his black-rimmed white eyes locked on her hips as they slowly widened. "What?" She looked down at herself as he abruptly cut himself off. The slit in her black dress reached her waist, revealing her entire leg and her hip on that side. Perhaps she was flashing a little too much information at him, like the fact she wasn't wearing any panties. She casually lowered it, covering her hip, but it didn't stop him from staring.
"You walked too fast. I had to keep up."
His gaze snapped to hers. "Or maybe you could have taken the hint." Cass shrugged that one off.
"Taking hints is not my style."
"I'm getting that impression. How about I make it blindingly clear for you?" He took a hard step towards her and glared down at her, attempting to use his height to his advantage, or perhaps the cold that pulsed off him in chilling waves. Goosebumps erupted over her chest and down her arms as a particularly frigid blast hit her. Diamond gritted his teeth and snarled, "Stop fucking stalking me." He twisted away from her and stomped down the path, leaving frosty footprints in his wake. What a curious little creature. His display of aggression had quite the opposite effect to what he probably wanted. Rather than scaring her into submission so she left him alone, it only made her want to pursue him and come to understand him better. He ruined all chances of that by making a beeline for the covered walkway that ran around the mansion, kicking his boots off and stalking along it, swiftly heading for the huge stone bath that overlooked the Zen garden. Spoil sport. She casually followed the path, taking her time about it, her gaze drifting over the flowers and the mossy boulders. It was tranquil, but a little dull without him. A sigh escaped her as her gaze tracked him. What was she doing? She was here for Miranda to keep her safe and ensure these gods could protect her, just as Eric had seen. She wasn't here to get to know them. She wasn't here to make friends. Diamond's steps slowed as he reached the tiled area between the bath and the showers, and his head turned to his left, revealing his profile to her. She had the oddest sensation he was looking at her, and then his shoulders shifted in a sigh and he disappeared from view down the corridor that would take him back to the main room of the house. She bit back a shriek when Diamond suddenly appeared right in front of her, black smoke clinging to his wide shoulders. "Your Highness is wanted in the house," he growled. "I suggest you don't keep Karis waiting." Before she could ask for a lift, he teleported again. She amended her earlier observation. He wasn't curious, he was irksome, rubbed her entirely the wrong way. God, she hated him. She huffed and stormed towards the house, ignoring how cold the stepping stones still were. When she reached his boots, she stopped, stared at them, told herself not to do it. She stooped, grabbed them, and carried them with her, smiled as she dropped them in the bath on her way past. Cass fixed her appearance, smoothing her dress over her curves and running her fingers through her hair, ensuring each wave was perfect. She cupped her breasts and jimmied them, making her cleavage appear fantastic. Satisfied she would make the right impression, that of sorceress not to be messed with meets every man's wet dream come true. She sashayed along the corridor between the kitchen and one wing of the house. Power flowed and ebbed, hummed in the air around her as she entered the long living room, and 7 gods turned to glare at her. What to say? She regally waved her hand.
"You may begin."
Karis's green eyes narrowed, the black slashes of his eyebrows drawing down above them as his lips thinned. He was handsome, beautiful almost, but she preferred her men a little more hot-blooded. She slid a look at Diamond where he leaned against the white wall to her right, close to the front door. Or perhaps a little more cold-blooded. His pale blue eyes met hers, and then he lowered them to his feet and folded his arms across his chest. Miranda bustled towards her, Calistos hot on her heels. She expected the blonde god to stop her ward, but rather than intervening, he kept pace with her and simply took up position beside her when she stopped next to Cass.
"Play nice,"
Miranda whispered in French. If she thought it would keep what she had said secret, she was sorely mistaken. The amused twist to Aries' lips said he understood her. Cal muttered, "Doubt she could manage that." Cass was tempted to utter a spell to make him a eunuch for a few hours, but doing so would only upset Miranda, so she behaved herself. "You guys can handle this." Aries looked to Karis. Karis nodded. Aries stomped towards her, looking every bit the warrior as he closed the distance between them. She kept her posture relaxed, but her guard went up, anticipation running through her to crank her tight inside and ready for anything. Rather than laying a hand on her, he merely gave her a black look as he stormed past her. She let the breath she had been holding slowly leak from between her lips. She had forgotten he had a female, a pretty little thing who was carrying his child, which was apparently a source of concern for him. Understandably. "I want to know everything, starting with your intentions." Karis stood in the middle of the room, flanked by 4 of his brothers, including the beast. Escher looked ready to rip her apart with his claws. She offered him a smile that went down about as well as a glass of acid.
"My only intention is to ensure Miranda is safe, protected."
She had figured an honest answer would at least curry her a little favor with the gods. Calistos made sure it didn't. Already told you that I can protect her. We don't need you. We don't even know if you're working for the enemy or not."
Well, that's charming.
She turned a frown on him.
I seem to recall saving your life. Who was it who made 3 demons drop dead?
Miranda stepped forwards, placing herself between them, and raised her hands as she faced Cass.
You can't blame them for being cautious.
"I recall you blowing up 3 demons, and then my reputation." Cal muttered the last 4 words, earning curious looks from 3 of his brothers. So he was bitter about the fact she had filled Miranda in on a few key facts about him, and now he wanted to turn Miranda and his brothers against her. Well, it wasn't going to happen. She gathered her thoughts, seeking the perfect retort. He sighed. "But I suppose you did save us, much as I hate to admit that. Mari vouches for you, too, which means if it comes down to it, I won't vote to kick you out." Damn him. She had just found an amazing comeback, too. Cass preened her hair.
Perhaps you could convince your brothers I could be an asset?
He jammed his hands into his pockets and shrugged. "That's your job. I vote we kick her out." Those words coming from her right had her head whipping that way. She stared at Diamond, shock rippling through her to steal her voice, although she wasn't sure why it surprised her, or why the thought that he didn't want her here working with them had a cold, sharp feeling going through her chest. "Seconded." Escher raised his hand, the sleeve of his dove-gray shirt falling back to reveal a trident on the inside of his wrist that was as black as night. Someone was still grumpy about her presence in his home. Merrick looked her over, his earthy eyes sharp and calculating. "She could prove useful, provided she's as powerful as Cal believes."
More powerful,
she put in. Diamond scoffed. She tossed daggers at him that hit their mark, judging by how he looked away from her.
It is just Beast and the one lacking a heart that wish me gone. Or do either of you two value my presence and what I can bring to this fight? If you would like, I can give you an example of my abilities. I just need a volunteer, an opponent. Say, him."
She pointed at Diamond. He pushed away from the wall, unfurling to his full height as his arms dropped to his sides. "You want to fight?" Cass tipped her chin up and turned her cheek to him.
It wouldn't even be a fight. 5 seconds and you'll be in the dirt begging me for mercy.
The air in the room turned frigid. Cass braced herself for an attack. "Diamond?" Karis's deep voice rolled through the room, and the air warmed again as the white-haired brute huffed and glared at him. "Perhaps you could finish your work checking the wards. She tries to start shit and I get kicked out. Nice." Diamond stormed towards her, and she couldn't stop herself from tensing this time. The bastard noticed it, grinned at her. He stepped close to her and hissed, "I might not be here, but my vote still counts. I want you out." "Diamond," Karis said, a note of warning in his voice. Diamond sneered at her and pushed past her, and she sucked in a breath as her shoulder burned, the instant cold like a fiery brand as it seared her. She rubbed her bare arm and scowled over her shoulder at his back. He reached the bathing area. Cass sidled closer to Miranda and put on a casual air. "What the?" An icy wave of air rolled over her, and she kept her eyes on Miranda, ignoring the god who was now closing the distance between them again. "My boots? Really? My boots?" He shoved the soggy articles in her face, splashing her with the bizarre combination of warm water and chunks of ice. Cass looked at them, her eyebrows pinned high on her forehead.
"Why, yes, they are your boots. Very observant of you."
She flinched when he growled right in her face. "Just you wait. The second you leave anything in this house, it's going in the pond." His eyes gained a wicked glimmer she told herself she didn't like. "In fact," she screamed as he grabbed her wrist and darkness engulfed her, and then she hit water. It crashed over her, filled her mouth, and had her choking as she breached the surface. "Not the fish!" Escher appeared above her as she spluttered and floundered, kicking her legs and flapping her arms. He snarled, "Watch the fish!" Cass gasped for air, sucking down another mouthful of pond water that had her retching as she came up again. She managed to roll onto her front and cursed when her hand and knees easily touched the bottom of the pond.
"Cass!"
Miranda's worried voice carried across the garden. At least someone gave a damn that she had been unceremoniously dunked in the pond. All Escher cared about was his fish. He glared at her as if this whole ruckus was her fault. Cass labored onto her feet, water streaming down her, the weight of it threatening to pull her dress down. She struggled to hold it up and keep herself covered as she narrowed her eyes on Escher.
Perhaps you should try blaming the one who tossed me in here like he was testing to see whether I would sink or float.
She waded towards the edge of the pool, where Miranda was now waiting, her blue eyes verging on violet as she held a hand out to her.
Cass muttered, "To think, I can't even escape persecution in the 21st century. At least the last people to attempt to drown me gave me advance warning."
Above her on the vermilion wooden bridge that arched over the pond, Diamond stopped laughing. She pulled herself out of the pond with Miranda's help and frowned down at her ruined dress.
"Well, there goes 2,000 euros of designer dress. Are you hurt?"
Miranda looked her over.
"Only my pride."
And her knees, and her throat, and everything. Escher loosed a long sigh. "The carp are all fine." Cass cast him a withering look.
"Bully for the carp."
She trudged across the gravel, refusing to let anyone see how much it hurt her bare feet. Diamond's gaze tracked her. She ignored him, and the temptation to use the eunuch spell on him, and breathed a quiet sigh of relief as she reached the large flat stones that formed a path through the delicate topiary.
"I am going to assume this was a delightful rite of passage to initiate me into the group, and I will not hold it against you."
She squared up to Karis where he stood on the edge of the covered walkway near a deep stone step, his arms folded over his black shirt and his emerald eyes fixed on Diamond. They lowered to her. She kept her voice calm, masking the feelings whirling inside her like a tempest.
"If we are going to argue again about my worth, or how I can help your side, or if I hear any more talk of me being voted out, I will be rather upset."
She stared into his eyes, letting him see in hers that by rather upset, she meant she was going to utterly destroy everything he held dear, starting with Diamond.
"Now if we are done, I would like to get clean and dry."
Karis slowly nodded. "We shall continue our discussion about how you can help us later." She dipped her chin, willing to talk with him, because she needed to be part of this group, needed them to accept her so she could remain close to Miranda. His green gaze slid back to Diamond, a troubled edge to it. Diamond continued to stare at her. As Cass swept towards the bathhouse, keeping her chin up and refusing to let anyone see the hurt brewing inside her as 1,000 thoughts weighed her down, Cal's voice rang out in the still air, echoing one thought in particular as he stopped near Diamond. "Dick?" Chapter 27. 2 days had passed since the rather unfortunate meeting, one Cass had banned her from talking about. Diamond had made his excuses and left before Cass had emerged from the bathhouse. Karis had decided that Cass could join the team, and that had been enough for most of the brothers to accept her into the group. The more stubborn of them, Escher in particular and Diamond, were still frosty with her friend. 2 days and nothing had happened. The inaction grated on Miranda. The latest she had heard was that Katerina had managed to teleport Merrick to a house where Eli, a wraith on the enemy's side, had taken her. No one had been there. It had been a dead end. Worse than that, Katerina's wraith brother, Guillaume, had no more information to give them. Another dead end. Now Katerina was working to turn Guillaume over to their side. The human-turned-demon wasn't interested in helping them, though, not like his sister. Diamond had finally made an appearance again yesterday and had been distant the entire time he had been in the house. Just before she had turned in for the day, something that was still weird to Miranda, Cal had taken her aside and asked her whether Cass had been hurt by Diamond when he had teleported her to the pond. Cass had overheard him and had refused to confirm or deny whether Diamond had injured her with his ice. Mari couldn't blame her friend for clinging to her mood with him, but really it was all a little childish. It had been wrong of Cass to dump his boots in the bath, but it had been equally as wrong of him to dump her in the pond. She sighed, unable to hold it back. She wanted everyone to get along, but she had the feeling that wasn't going to happen where Cass and Diamond were concerned. The two seemed intent on hating each other. Several of the brothers had suggested drawing the enemy out by going to the gates. The enemy needed them open in order to breach the link between the underworld and the mortal one, by somehow shattering the gate while it was active. Doing that would cause the underworld and the mortal one to pull and push at each other, slowly merging them and unleashing catastrophic events across the globe, creating a new realm for the enemy to rule, one where humans were no longer the apex predator and were now the livestock and the entertainment for demons. Karis and Ares had been against going to the gates, and so had Diamond. Even Valen had expressed concerns about taking such a path. Cal had suggested an alternative way of luring the enemy out. The brothers would stay firmly away from the gates, not even heading to them when a hellspawn wanted to pass through them. Everyone, including her, had agreed it was a good plan. The best they had, really. If they waited long enough, the enemy would grow desperate, the inaction grating on them as fiercely as it did on her and the brothers. The enemy would make another move, and the brothers would be ready for them. The wait was killing her, though. Miranda had thought she could handle it, but being cooped up in the Tokyo mansion with little to do was slowly driving her crazy. The cold, vicious side of her blood that craved vengeance was growing more persistent, so much so that more than once she had found herself wandering towards the gatehouse in the white wall that enclosed the mansion. Cass had caught her the first time and had suggested she play for a while to take her mind off things. It had worked, but the moment her fingers had become too sore to play the pieces well, that hunger to hunt down the Necromancer and his allies had returned. The second time she had been caught by Escher, and he hadn't been pleased. Cal had talked his brother down for her, and he had suggested that she train in order to not only hone her skills, but work off some of her energy and make her feel that she was getting somewhere. Miranda had found the idea appealing. It wasn't just the thought of sparring and practicing. It was the prospect of possibly learning new moves and ways to control herself when she was fighting, keeping the cold, dangerous side of her contained. Cal hadn't had a chance to offer his services. Cass had practically dragged her away from him, saying that she would teach her all she needed to know. Miranda dodged the twisting violet orb that came at her. It did a sharp arc and whizzed back towards her, and she leaned left, evading it again. While Miranda was learning how to use her speed to her advantage and was testing the limits of it, she wasn't exactly learning anything new about fighting. Not unless Cass thought she was going to dodge, duck, and dive her way out of danger.
"This isn't working,"
Miranda said as she dropped to avoid the orb.
"Where's the danger? I don't think the enemy is going to be annoying me with shiny balls of magic."
She felt bad when Cass pouted, but this wasn't the time for her to be gentle and gratefully accept what she was being offered when it wasn't what she needed. Dodging magic balls wasn't giving her the release she needed. She didn't feel in danger. She didn't feel that burst of energy and excitement and fear she had when she had been training with Cal in London. She needed to be pushed to the limit, needed a good workout to burn off some of the rage knotting inside her and make her feel she was getting somewhere, doing something productive. Cass planted her hands on her hips.
"Shiny balls of magic is how I fight. You're not suggesting I get physical."
"Get physical," Diamond snorted as he strode past them, heading for the house, his boots loud on the pale gravel that covered most of the front garden. "Like someone like you knows how to get physical." She arched an eyebrow at him.
"What is that meant to mean, Snegovic?"
Diamond turned incredulous blue eyes on her. "Snowman? That's the best insult you can come up with?"
"That I can say in front of Mari at least. Believe me, I have others in mind whenever I look at you."
Cass tilted her chin up, jutting it out. "I think the word you're really looking for is krasivi." He grinned at her, flashing straight white teeth. Whatever that word meant, it flustered Cass. Her friend muttered something in Russian under her breath as she imperiously turned away from him.
"Snegovic,"
Cass bit out. Diamond shrugged his broad shoulders and continued to the porch. Just before he stepped inside, he muttered, "Koldunya." Cass blushed again.
"Maybe try not insulting our hosts?"
Miranda didn't think that the infighting was going to help them in the battle against the enemy. Cal had told her that they needed to be a united front. For some reason, Cass seemed determined to irritate Diamond. Cass flicked Miranda a black look.
"How was I meant to know he could speak Russian? Because he's several hundred years old and has been in this world for 200 of them?"
Something Miranda still found incredible. Apparently, Cal was the baby of the group at a tender 765.
"It stands to reason he might know a few languages, Cass."
Cal spoke fluent French, as well as modern and ancient Greek, Spanish, German, and a few other languages.
"What did he call you?"
She said. Cass grumbled,
Which?
not as bad as Miranda had presumed, and far better than Cass was dishing out to him.
Oh, I'm not cut out for this,
Cass huffed and pulled a face.
I thought I could train you, but I don't know the first thing about fighting with fists.
Miranda was tired and, feeling honest because of it, couldn't stop herself from saying,
You wanted to stop me from training with Cal. What is it you have against him? He's taken good care of me, Cass. He helped me find out what I am, and he did his best to protect me from those demons, even with his powers restricted.
She could understand why Cass wanted to protect her, but Cass didn't know Cal as she did. She only knew what she had seen. She didn't know how he felt or the man he was when no one was watching him. Miranda went to Cass and hugged her.
I know you want to keep me safe, but standing between me and Cal, that's only hurting me.
She waited, and relief flowed through her when Cass wrapped her up in her arms and held her.
I'm sorry. Since Eric died, I'm feeling a bit protective of you.
Cass lifted her hand and smoothed Miranda's hair, a comforting touch that Miranda soaked up. As crazy as Cass made her, Miranda was glad that she was here with her.
I miss him,
she murmured, throat tight.
Me too.
Cass hugged her closer and whispered on a sigh.
Me too.
She rested her head on Cass's shoulder and enjoyed the warmth of her friend's arms around her and the quiet that came over her. She was so tired. She wanted to sleep, but she felt restless, the need to hunt her father's killers keeping her constantly on edge. Cass muttered,
Your God is watching us.
He was? She drew back and looked around, stopped when she spotted him near a tree in the corner of the garden. He didn't hide that he was watching her, and she savored the concern that shone in his blue eyes as much as she had Cass's hug. She smiled at him and stepped back as Cass released her.
Cass was just saying she needed someone else to teach me.
Cass preened her long black hair.
Only because I need to get some things from my home, mind. It's important you continue your training while I'm gone.
Now her friend was making excuses, covering up the fact that she didn't know much about fighting without magic. The look on Cal's face said it was clear he knew Cass was trying not to lose face by admitting there was something she couldn't do. That's okay, he said as he approached them. I can take over for a while. Fill in for you like. It was sweet of him to play along. Cass nodded, turned to her, and touched her cheek, her brow furrowing as she looked down into Miranda's eyes.
Be careful now.
Miranda had the feeling her friend wasn't talking only about being careful during the training Cal was going to put her through. Cass wanted her to be careful with her heart, too, and other things that made Miranda want to blush as Cal's gaze landed on her, sending 1,000 volts shooting through her veins to heat her. Cass went inside. Cal offered his hand to her. Ready? He husked, his gaze heating as he looked at her, sending a hot, achy shiver through her.
As I'll ever be,
she breathed, unable to get her voice above a whisper as need coiled inside her, heating her another 10 degrees. His eyes darkened. Hunger rolled through her. She slipped her hand into his, and another bolt of lightning struck along her nerves, tugging a gasp from her lips. Cal pulled her to him, banded his arm around her waist, and kissed her. The heat inside her exploded into wildfire that scorched every inch of her, and her heart raced, drumming fiercely against her chest as she moaned and kissed him back, a desperate edge to it. His lips clashed with hers, his breaths heavy as he tugged her closer still. God, I want you, Mari, he growled against her mouth, a sharp thrill chasing through her in response. He sounded so hungry, so possessive, and as filled with need as she was. She grasped his shoulders and pulled him closer still, needing to feel every inch of him against her. She hesitated, heart stuttering, fear clashing with hunger inside her, pulling her in opposite directions. She crushed the fear and yanked him against her.
I want you too.
Cal groaned, bent, and lifted her, and then froze and cursed. He pressed his forehead to hers.
What's wrong?
She squirmed in his arms, unable to keep still as excitement flooded her. The thought she was finally going to know a man's touch, Cal's touch, pushing her right to the edge. My room is right next to the TV area. That almost tossed a bucket of ice on her libido, but it wasn't taking no for an answer, not this time.
Somewhere else, then?
She breathed and kissed him again, hoping to convince him, because if he delayed much longer, her nerve was going to fail her. Too dangerous. She wanted to curse at him.
So whose room is furthest away from where everyone might be?
Was that her voice so raspy and needy? Karis's. He didn't sound happy about that. But fuck him. He never uses it. Darkness whirled around them, and when it receded, they were in a square room with beautiful depictions of dragons and other things painted on the panels. It was certainly a step up from the plain white walls of Cal's room, but she didn't mention that. She didn't want him feeling self-conscious, and he would if she compared their rooms. She wanted him wild and reckless. She wanted to be wild and reckless, too. Cal carried her over to a wide wooden dresser and set her down on top of it. He kissed her again, slower now when she wanted it fast and frantic, filled with passion that would keep her skirting the edge of control so that little voice at the back of her head remained distant, barely noticeable. She was doing this. Her heart skipped a beat at that thought. She fought the trickle of nerves that ran through her, trying to stem the flow of it as she kissed Cal, as his lips danced over hers and their breath mingled. She had never kissed anyone the way she always ended up kissing him, so desperately, as if she feared it would end before she was ready. Miranda slipped her hand around the nape of his neck and held him to her as she kissed him. She moaned as his tongue traced hers, teasing it and sending another shiver through her. She wanted this to be leisurely, slow so she could savor it, but her body wasn't getting the message. Her hips rocked forwards. Cal grunted and then groaned when she did it again, and that trickle of nerves was in danger of becoming a torrent when she felt the hard bulge in his jeans press against her. The thrill that shot through her damned the nerves, though, holding them back. She did it again and again, rolling her hips to meet his, to rub that length of steel. It didn't satisfy her. Each stroke of it between her thighs only made her want more. Cal drew back and seized her hips, stilling them as he gazed down into her eyes, his filled with a myriad of emotions that blended together into one heated look. We really doing this? His eyes searched hers. We don't have to rush. A blush scalded her cheeks as something dawned on her. He knew that she was new to this, untouched. Part of Miranda wanted to take the out he was clearly giving her, but the rest screamed that she wanted this. She wanted to know what it was like to be with Cal. She didn't want to wait any longer, not when everything was so uncertain. Miranda twisted the front of his t-shirt into her fist and pulled him back to her, seizing his mouth in a passionate kiss she hoped showed him that she was serious. They were doing this. Chapter 28. Cal groaned and pressed closer, shifted his hands up to her waist. Miranda gasped into his mouth as his palms made contact with her bare flesh. Heat rolled through her, slowly stealing control from her, and she couldn't stop herself from lowering her hand to the hem of his t-shirt. Her belly fluttered and she steeled her nerves. She was going to do this, touch a man like this for the first time. She wasn't sure what to expect, but as she dipped her hand beneath his t-shirt and her fingers made contact with the firm ridges of his stomach, fire swept through her. His skin was soft like silk, but his muscles were hard, screaming of strength that had heat pooling lower. Miranda lost herself a little as she boldly explored his stomach, loving the way his breath hitched when she lightly raked her nails over his muscles, and how his kiss slowed from time to time, as if he couldn't concentrate on it while she was touching him. He pulled back again, and she wanted to berate him for stealing himself away from her. But then he reached over his head, gripped the back of his t-shirt, and yanked it off.
Oh, God,
she muttered, confronted by the delicious glory of his bare chest. She had seen it before, but seeing it now when things were getting a little hot and heavy cranked up the heat inside her to an unbearable degree. An ache bloomed between her thighs. More? He husked, his hands dropping to the waist of his jeans. Miranda nodded eagerly, perhaps a little too eagerly, judging by his soft chuckle. She repaid him for that teasing laugh by leaning forwards, grabbing his jeans and tugging him to her. His hands dropped to his sides. Her fingers trembled as she fumbled with the button, pulse racing faster as her mouth dried out. She had never seen a man naked before, not like this anyway, not when he was hard. She licked her lips, the hunger burning hotter in her veins as she finally popped the top button and moved to the next. With each one she unfastened, her nerves grew, and adrenaline surged, and that ache between her thighs grew sweeter. She finally freed the last button, and Cal pushed his jeans down for her, revealing long-toned legs and a pair of black trunks. "More?" He half smiled as he ran his fingers along the elastic of his trunks. Miranda felt as if she might die if he didn't go on, and that fierce part of her that she had been struggling to contain over the last few days rose to the fore. No one was going to deny her what she wanted, what she needed. Her hand shot to the front of his black trunks before she was even aware of what she was doing, and Cal grunted, his face contorting, as her palm met the hard length of his cock. "Sweet gods," he muttered and leaned forwards, bracing his hands on the dresser on either side of her thighs. She found she liked that reaction, found she wanted more. She stroked him, feeling the heat of him through the material, studying how he jerked and pulsed, and seemed to grow harder still. Was that even possible? The bolder side of her urged her to take the next step. Who was she to deny it? Miranda went with the flow, beginning to relax as she held Cal at her mercy, feeling powerful as his handsome face twisted and he groaned, his brow furrowing as he leaned more weight against the dresser. When he moaned her name, she took the leap. She slid her hand beneath the waist of his trunks, a moan of her own slipping from her lips as her palm met the velvet-covered hot steel of him. She'd had her share of fantasies about men in her time, but nothing she had imagined came close to this. She stroked him, caressing her palm up and down, fascinated by how he began to pant, how his expression alternated between bliss and pain. When she idly stroked her thumb over the blunt tip, he grunted and seized her wrist, stopping her from doing it again. Hadn't he liked that? He panted, "Wait, just a second. Need a moment." Perhaps she had pushed too far too fast. He straightened and swallowed, exhaled, and dragged down another breath. He was glorious as he ran a hand over his hair, his muscles shifting in a tempting way, keeping that heat inside her rolling at a boil. She absorbed the sight of him, taking pleasure from just looking at him. Would he feel pleasure like this if he could look at her? Her nerves returned, but she refused to let them get the better of her as she gripped the hem of her top and pulled it up. Cal's gaze zipped to her stomach as she exposed it, the heat of his eyes on her giving her courage as his blue irises darkened with need, with pleasure. She pulled her top up, took a breath to steady herself when she reached her breasts, and then tugged it off. She lowered it to her chest at first, suddenly conscious of his eyes on her, but as he continued to stare, that hunger shining brightly in his eyes, her confidence returned. Miranda discarded her top and sat there, waiting for him to make the next move. He swooped on her mouth with a wicked groan. His hands cupped her breasts. Miranda moaned, the wanton sound of it shocking her as much as the way her body arched into his touch, seeking firmer contact. A shiver ran through her as he teased her nipples through her bra, her breath hitching as tingles swept outwards from their stiff peaks. "Cal," she breathed, her hand sliding around his nape, and seized command of the kiss again, unable to stop herself as all the heat condensed into a burning need that demanded she satisfy it. She needed to feel him, and needed to ease this ache inside her. He reached around her and unhooked her bra, pulled the garment down her arms, and groaned low as he peered at her breasts. He fell to his knees before her, planted his hand between her shoulder blades, and pulled her to him. His mouth seared her breasts, 1,000 arcs of lightning shooting outwards from the point where his lips caressed her, and then he pushed her right over the edge. His mouth claimed her nipple. Miranda tipped her head back and bit her lip, stifling the cry that wanted to burst from her lips, aware that others were in the mansion. She had thought his touch had been bliss before, that she had been experiencing pleasure. She had thought wrong. This was pleasure, and it lit her up inside, had her squirming and restless, aching for more. Cal seemed to sense her need, or perhaps his own fueled him. He undid her jeans and gripped the waist of them, and she pushed her bottom up, allowing him to slip them down her thighs. The air was cool against her bare skin as he stripped her, but the heat of his touch as he caressed her calves and up to her knees, stroked his hands over her thighs, chased it away. His lips worked black magic on her breasts, making her breathless. The heat that bloomed between her thighs turned to wetness that only had her writhing harder, aching for him to touch her there. His fingers reached her panties, and she arched towards him, goading him. He growled as he pulled them down, as he slipped them over her feet and tossed them away. His mouth tugged harder on her nipple, ripping a gasp from her as lightning struck again, had her hips jacking up off the dresser. Cal groaned and broke away from her breasts, pressed wet kisses to her stomach as he trailed downwards. Her breaths came faster, anticipation hitting her hard as she realized where he was going and what he was going to do. Pleasure rocked her as he brushed his thumbs between her thighs, heat shooting through her body. He eased her thighs wider apart, and she expected to feel embarrassed that he was able to see all of her. The way he growled as he gazed at her only made her feel more confident. She covered her mouth with her hand as bliss shot through her with the first brush of his tongue over her most sensitive flesh. She bit her palm as he teased and stroked it, coaxing more wetness from her. He groaned and tugged her closer to the edge of the dresser, his tongue circling her pert bead. She couldn't stop herself from gripping his head, twisting her fingers into his hair as he licked her, sending waves of pleasure blazing outwards from her core.
Cal,
she mumbled into her palm, her breaths coming faster still as need mounted inside her, shoving her right to the edge. She needed more. She was already close, teetering on the precipice. Cal stroked his fingers down her, and she arched her back and stifled another moan as they caressed her entrance. Gods, you're so... He licked her harder, devoured her as she tried to hold back another moan. He didn't need to finish his sentence for her to know what he meant. She was positively dripping with need. He eased his finger forwards, and it slipped into her without resistance. As the pad of it pressed against something inside her, her hips jacked up off the dresser and a cry tore from her lips. That's it. Give in to it, Mari, he murmured against her as her entire body quaked, her ears ringing and heart thundering as pleasure rolled through her, crashed over her in waves that stole her breath from her lungs. He stroked inside her, making those waves collide and grow stronger as she quivered. Her breaths blasted back at her from her palm, every inch of her locked tight as release took her. Cal teased her with his tongue, his finger continuing to move inside her. She lost track of time as the pleasure subsided and need began to build again. He pulled his finger from her and lowered his head, stroking his mouth over her opening. He shuddered and groaned, probed her with his tongue, and she blushed as she realized he was tasting her and what he had done to her. She wanted to slap him away, but his words echoed in her head. She gave in instead, surrendered to him. That ache returned, demanding more, and Cal fed it as he teased her nub with his tongue and eased 2 fingers into her this time. It felt tight at first, but then she began to relax as pleasure built, as her breaths began to sough from her lips.
Cal,
she whispered, practically whimpered. She needed him. She needed more. He pushed to his feet, continuing to pump his fingers inside her, and kissed her. She tasted herself on him at first, but then she only tasted his heat and the need that coiled inside him and her both as their lips clashed. He drew his fingers out of her, and her breath hitched as something replaced them. The blunt crown pierced her, and she grew damper, eager to feel him stretching her, hungry to have him inside her. She tried to rock her hips to meet him, but Cal held her firm, rendering her immobile. Slow, he husked against her lips. She wasn't sure she could obey that command, not as he inched into her, as his heat branded her and he stretched her, filling her so sweetly. She wanted to rush, wanted to know what it would feel like when they were joined completely. It was hard to keep still as he eased into her, at least at first. As more of him entered her, that wicked bliss returned to flood her, the pleasure of their joining flowing through her. His lips slowed against hers as his hips pressed against her thighs, and she thought he was done. But then he shifted his hands to her legs, pulled them apart, and sank deeper. A cry tore from her lips, the brief spark of pain overwhelming the pleasure that had been growing inside her. Cal kissed her softly, murmured things against her lips as he stood still, his length buried deep within her. She breathed through the pain, and as it subsided, she grew aware of the thickness and heat of him. Need burned through her, and she didn't deny it. Miranda rocked her hips towards him and moaned as he grunted, as he gathered her to him and kissed her harder. He ground his hips forwards, pressing himself deeper still, and then withdrew. It was too much. The tip of his shaft rubbed that spot he had touched before to bring her to release, and tingles shot through her, the ache growing fiercer, more demanding. She wanted to rock to meet him as he plunged back into her, but it was hard when she had to remain seated. She wrapped her legs around him, had to do something to make him do as she wanted, before she exploded from frustration. She needed release. She pressed her heels into his buttocks, urging him back into her whenever he withdrew. He grunted and leaned over her, planted one hand against the dresser and supported her back with the other as she leaned back. He sank deeper into her, a thrill chasing through her as he quickened his pace. His breaths burst against her lips with each surge of his cock, each swift withdrawal. It still wasn't enough. Miranda kissed him harder, used her feet as leverage to make him go faster. His pelvis slammed against hers, sparks ricocheting through her as it struck her sensitive spot.
Oh, God!
She clutched him, squeezed him with her body, and ripped a grunt from his lips. His pace picked up, each deep thrust hitting her in just the right spot to have her breathless, on the verge, back on that precipice and ready to fall. His fingers pressed hard into her hip and he held her in place as he frantically pumped her, holding her at his mercy. She pressed her mouth to his as the need that had been condensing inside her detonated, her entire body shaking as he plunged into her. He groaned and grunted, his hips curling as she throbbed around him, as stars winked across her vision and heat blazed a path through her. Another wave of bliss crashed over her as Cal jerked to a halt and his cock pulsed, heat flooding her with each throb that sent an aftershock of pleasure through her. He dropped his head to her shoulder, breathing hard as his body quaked, trembling in time with hers. Miranda stroked his sweat-slicked back, struggling to come down from the high as a sense of power flooded her. She felt incredible, strong, confident, sexy. She had never felt anything like this, and she knew she would never feel anything like it again, not with anyone else. It was Cal and Cal alone who made her feel this way. He leaned his cheek against her and exhaled slowly.
That was incredible.
She idly traced patterns on his back, a little dazed. He chuckled and pulled out. She fluttered her eyes open and frowned as he removed a condom. Something dark curled through her, stirring the cold.
Why did you wear that?
He tied it and looked at it. I figured it was necessary. Miranda's other side felt as if he had wanted to deny her something, the real pleasure of feeling him naked inside her. He had held something back. He looked from the condom to her, and his eyebrows drew down. I'm getting the feeling this has upset you. I was just thinking of you. I didn't know what the situation was, or what you wanted. She knew that. The other part of her didn't. All it knew was that it had been denied something it had wanted, something she fiercely craved.
I'm protected,
she said, and tried to control herself as she stared up into his eyes. Tried and failed. She didn't recognize her own voice as she growled.
Next time, you'll be naked inside me.
Chapter 29. Cal had found it impossible to concentrate over the last day. Miranda's fierce demand constantly rang in his mind, cranking up his temperature, and more than once he had been forced to excuse himself as he had lost control of his body. A few of those times he had hoped Miranda would follow him. She blushed 1,000 shades of red whenever he looked at her with heat in his eyes, turned awkward and started to fidget. Her fury side had been firmly in control, or maybe at least partly in control in that moment. Her eyes had been violet ringed with black. He had learned something new about the Irines. They didn't like to be denied the thing they wanted, whether that was vengeance or something else. Her words rang around his head again, shredding his focus and his control. The thought of being inside her again, close to her like that, was enough to push him to the edge. The thought she wanted him naked inside her, giving him the ultimate pleasure, shoved him right over it. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had sex with someone without using a condom, and he really couldn't remember if he had ever had anything like what he had had with Miranda, something that was fast becoming a relationship. He watched her as she went through the motions, fighting an invisible foe, practicing the moves he had shown her and preparing to spar with him again. "Ready?" he said when she stopped and wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. Her workout clothes were going to be the death of him one day. Now he knew her intimately, seeing all those curves inflamed him, had him struggling to concentrate. He wasn't doing a great job of teaching her how to fight, not today anyway. She nodded, untied her blonde tresses, clawed them back to neaten them, and tied them again. She blew out her breath. Cal launched a punch at her and she went to block it, but he dodged left, using speed to his advantage. She grunted as he tapped her on the shoulder, a light blow that wouldn't do any damage. She huffed and came at him, a swift strike followed by an uppercut that almost hit him. Her next punch landed, slamming into his jaw. His vision wobbled. He shook off the blow as he rubbed his jaw. She was getting better, and she was getting stronger too. As her confidence grew, her strength seemed to grow too. It made him feel a hell of a lot better about letting her fight, something that was going to happen according to her. Cass had backed her up when she had announced she was going to be out there on the battlefield when the enemy made their move. He ducked beneath her next swing and gave her a tap in the kidney.
"You're faster than before."
She huffed and tried again, missing him by a mile this time. "Focus," he snapped and swung at her, catching her on the shoulder again. "I'm faster because I need you ready for the speed at which the enemy will move. They won't be sparring with you, Mari. They'll be coming at you with everything they have, and we don't know how strong the Necromancer will be." She closed the gap between them, her blows coming faster. He blocked one with his forearm, batting her hand away, and stepped back so she overreached with the other punch, putting her off balance. He took her legs out and felt like a dick when she went down, hitting the gravel hard on her face. She muttered a curse in French, picked herself up like a champion, and came at him again. He blocked and parried, danced with her as she grew more precise with her strikes, and started to utilize the footwork he had shown her. She was nimble on her feet, landed 3 blows in a row, none of them gentle taps. After every blow she landed, she would move back a step, though. "Keep pressing the advantage. If you have your enemy on the back foot, push forwards. Don't give them time to recover." He swung at her, forcing her to dodge.
"But you're not my enemy."
She swept right, evading another of his blows. "I am right now," he grinned. "Later we'll be lovers again." A blush darkened her cheeks. She froze just as he expected her to dodge, and his fist plowed into her cheek, harder than he had intended because he honestly hadn't expected to land the blow. She staggered to her right, her hand flying up to her cheek. "Damn it, Mari," he muttered and went to check on her. She nailed him between the legs with a swift kick he didn't see coming. Cal doubled over, grunted, and dropped to his knees as he clutched his balls. She hadn't caught him hard, but pain still blazed through him, robbing him of breath.
"Cal."
She sank to her knees beside him, her face a picture of worry, her blue eyes wide and holding a hint of violet.
"I'm sorry."
He shook his head, unable to speak as he struggled to breathe. He was glad none of his brothers were in the house to witness this. Escher had taken Iko to see her parents for the afternoon, vowing they would return before nightfall. Cal rubbed himself and gritted, "It might need to be kissed better." He meant it as a joke. Miranda tensed, her entire face heating, and looked as if she wanted to run away from him, or at least part of her wanted to run away. Her pupils dilated, darkening her irises, telling him that some part of her was entertaining the thought and apparently enjoying it. "Mari." He wanted to tell her it had been a joke, that he didn't honestly expect her to do that. She silenced him with a kiss. He groaned, captured her nape, and seized her lips, his mind racing forwards, filled with what she had said to him about next time. This time. She was a wild, demanding little thing as she yanked his t-shirt off, her hands greedy as they explored his torso. Her eyes darkened further, had him falling under her spell as she raked them over him, a wicked light entering them. He wasn't the only one thinking ahead, but he was still thinking. He pulled her to him and teleported with her, taking her to his room so they could have some privacy. The moment they landed, she was kissing him again, each sweep of her lips over his sending hunger swirling through him, stoking his need. He wanted to touch her again, wanted to explore her more thoroughly, learning every inch of her and all the things that she liked, and the ones that made her scream his name. Her hand shook against his bare chest, fingers trembling to betray her nerves as she skimmed them over his muscles. He rose to his knees before her and let her do as she wanted, kept still so she would grow more comfortable with doing this. Touching him. He moaned when she raked short nails down his stomach, followed it with a low groan as she leaned forwards and pressed kisses to his chest. He wanted to tangle his hand in her hair and guide her, hurry her, but he locked his hands at his sides, letting her take the lead. She trailed her lips down the valley between his pectorals, her palms caressing either side of her head, a sensory overload that he savored. If there had been a time when he had experienced something like this, a tender exploration of his body, but one that roused heat in his veins and filled him with a fierce hunger, he couldn't remember it. He relished every lick, every kiss, every stroke of her hands, and if he hadn't already been on his knees, he would have fallen to them to beg her for more, to beg her to keep doing this to him. Forever. Forever? He expected to feel shock as that desire hit him, the depth of his need of her so powerful that it was in danger of stirring the darker side of his blood, that possessive part of him that growled at him to stake a claim on her. But all he felt was contentment, a sense that everything was right in the world, that this was exactly how things were meant to be between them. He lifted his hand and brushed his palm over her cheek, captured her jaw and lifted her head so her eyes locked with his. The heat of passion slowly faded from her eyes, morphing into warmth that had him falling deeper into them. He wanted her to look at him that way forever. He wanted her to love him the way that he loved her, even when that terrified him, even when he feared that if she loved him, he would inevitably lose her and somehow it would be his fault. He shoved that fear to the back of his mind, focusing on the present and refusing to let the past taint what he had with Miranda. He leaned over and kissed her, softly and slowly, reverently, hoping that she would feel that love in it, would know what she had done to him, and that she was all he needed, all that he wanted, and he would do all in his power to protect her and keep her safe. Mari, whatever Cass told you about me. He drew back and cupped her cheeks, keeping her eyes on his. He needed this out there. As vulnerable as it would make him feel, he needed her to know. That isn't me. Not anymore. I changed the day I met you. You changed me. It's only you for me now. A light filled her eyes, brightening and warming the blue, and her lips curved in a slight smile. She pushed upwards and captured his mouth again, kissed him slowly, in a way that left him in no doubt that she felt something for him, too. Her hand skimmed downwards to his hips, teasing the muscles there, and he moaned softly as she boldly moved lower, fingers tracing the waist of his sweats. The dark possessive part of him kept his mind on claiming her, making him ache to be inside her again, to stamp her with his mark and possess her. She was his, and he wasn't going to let anything tear them apart. He didn't need to get barbaric on her, allowing his possessive side to control him. The caveman act probably wouldn't go down well with someone like Mari. He kissed her softly, savoring the feel of her lips on his, their breaths mingling, and how she tentatively stroked her tongue over his, breaching his lips. He twined his fingers in her hair and pulled her closer, kissed her deeper, eliciting a moan from her that hit him like a drug, had him chasing another high. His little cellist was addictive, that was for sure. Addictive and demanding. Her hand cupped him through his sweats, threatening to obliterate the control he was fiercely holding on to in order to keep things sweet and tender between them. He wanted to make love with her this time. Miranda seemed to have other ideas. She slid her hand beneath the waist of his sweats, and his eyes rolled back in his head as the soft heat of her stroked him, his kiss faltering as his focus shot to his dick. Mari, he murmured, unsure what he was trying to say. A warning that if she did that too long, he would climax? A plea to give him more? Whatever he had wanted to say, she drove it out of his head as she broke away from his lips and kissed down his chest again. He tried to convince himself that she wasn't going where he thought she was, but she blazed a trail down his stomach and his cock jerked for her attention, growing harder as he thought about her mouth on him. She pushed his sweats down, freeing him, and he seized her wrists. Miranda looked up at him, tropical eyes telling him that her fury side wasn't in control. that she really wanted to do this. "You don't have to," he started, but she cut him off with a shake of her head. She twisted her hands free of his grip and whispered,
"I want to."
He didn't get another chance to stop her. She stroked a hand down his shaft, revealing the blunt crown, and then her mouth was on him. Every sense fired, collided and blended together into one mind-blowing feeling that sent him shooting into the stratosphere as she licked him, exploring him with her lips. He focused, forcing himself to keep still when all he wanted to do was twine his fingers in her hair and thrust, seeking the release he needed. Desire was swift to build as she teased him, as her mouth enveloped him, warm and moist, his new favorite drug. She bobbed her head on him, her hand gripping him as she sucked him, doing far more than kissing him better. He panted, his focus slipping as wave after wave of bliss rolled through him, had his balls swiftly drawing up as release neared. Cal pressed a hand to her head, torn between holding her on him and pushing her back. Pushing her back won, because that dark possessive part of him wanted to stamp his claim on her by finding release inside her. She frowned up at him, the hint of violet in her irises telling him that he had angered her by denying her what she wanted. Well, he had to deny her one thing to give her the other. "You said you wanted me, naked, inside you," he husked, voice scraping low. The heat in her eyes blazed hotter, and she eased back, the flare of arousal that laced the air with a heady scent tearing a groan from him. Gods, he needed to be inside her again. He needed to feel her, all of her, without anything between them. She was swift to stand, bringing her hips eye level with him. She pulled off her tank and shimmied out of her leggings, pushing them down to reveal her shapely toned legs. Cal stopped her when she went to remove her panties, replacing her hands with his. He eased them down her thighs and groaned as he revealed the neat thatch of gold at the apex of them. He wanted to taste her again. She stepped out of them for him, and he caught her right ankle and pulled it towards him. He pressed his mouth to her mound, delved his tongue between her plush lips, and savored the moan that rolled from her lips. She tasted divine, was already ready for him. He stroked his fingers along her and slid one into her, his dick kicking as he felt how ready she was. He gently pumped her as he suckled, as he laved and flicked his tongue over her, teasing her closer to the edge, just as she had teased him.
"Cal."
He loved the way she said his name like that, passion-drenched and needy, a plea that he would always answer. He lowered her leg, pulled behind her knees so she fell into him and rolled. She hit the bedding on her back, and he settled over her, his heart racing, a flicker of nerves running through him as he thought about what he was about to do.
"Cal."
She stroked her hand over his hair, cupped his nape, and lured him down to her. He shifted forwards and kissed her, softly and slowly, trying to keep things tender, trying to show her without words how much she meant to him. She wrapped her legs around his waist and eased him down against her, and groaned in time with him when his shaft met her slick heat. He rubbed against her, couldn't stop himself as her heat scalded him, as he ached to be inside her. His cock kicked and throbbed, eager for more. Miranda skimmed her hand down his back and over his hip, slipped it between them to stroke him, silently telling him what she wanted. He pulled back as her legs loosened and gripped his shaft, pressed his free palm to the soft bedding and looked down between them as he guided himself to her entrance. Her breath hitched as the blunt head slid down her, as it breached her and nudged inside.
"Cal,"
she murmured. He swallowed and eased forwards, inching into her, a groan rolling up his throat as she sheathed him. When he was seated as deep as he could go, he lowered himself and kissed her, absorbed how good it felt and how close to her he felt. She stroked his shoulders and teased his nape as she kissed him back, and he swallowed her gasp as he rolled his hips, easing a little deeper still, making her take more of him. She was tight around him, a hot glove that scalded him, marked him just as he wanted to mark her. He was hers now, whether she wanted that or not. He slowly withdrew almost all the way out of her and then eased back in, building a steady pace as the feel of her threatened to become too much for him. She kissed him, groaning softly against his lips.
"This feels so much better."
It did. He would have said that, but he was struggling to focus as he slowly pumped her, as he rested on his right elbow and lowered his left hand to her hip. He slid it beneath her backside and lifted her, moaning with her as he plunged deeper still as he thrust into her. She took all of him. He kissed her and curled his hips, gradually building momentum as they fell into an easy rhythm. Her hips rolled to meet his every thrust, her sweet cries like music to his ears as she sought release. When she grew wilder, her heart pounding in his ears and her moans coming faster, he pressed his knees to the floor for leverage and picked up the pace. Miranda moaned against his lips as he pumped her harder, gripped her hip tightly to keep her in place as he drove them both towards a release that promised to be life-altering. He grunted as she tightened around him, as her heat clenched him and he thrust into her, his hips pistoning as he slowly lost control and the need for release took over. It took her over, too, had her pressing her nails into his shoulders as she kissed him harder, a desperate meeting of their mouths as she writhed in his arms.
More.
She pulled him closer and nipped at his lip. Cal obeyed. He lifted her backside higher and plunged deep inside her. She cried out, her back arching and breasts thrusting into the air as her mouth opened and her eyes screwed shut. Her body trembled around his, core milking him hard, gripping him fiercely, pulling him over the edge with her. He shouted her name as seed boiled up his shaft and it burst from him, waves of it that had him grunting as he kept thrusting, unable to stop himself as he spilled, as he claimed her. His thrust slowed, his breath racing from him and heart thundering as bliss rolled through him, as he held Miranda to him and struggled to come down. She lay beneath him, a hazy look on her face, her eyes hooded as she idly toyed with her hair. Apparently, he wasn't the only one who had liked that. He eased down and kissed her, pouring his feelings for her into it, hoping she would know without him saying the words that he loved her, that he needed her, that he was never letting her go. Chapter 30. Miranda couldn't sleep. She woke just an hour after dozing off in Cal's arms shortly before dawn, still not quite accustomed to sleeping through the day. She had just been getting used to it in London, but swapping to Tokyo time had thrown her again. In the hope it would wear her out, she had gone through the moves Cal had shown her, practicing them again and again. It had tired her, but she hadn't wanted to crawl back under the covers next to Cal while she had been sweaty. She had risked taking a shower, sure that Escher wouldn't wake and see her, and that had unfortunately woken her up again. She had debated watching TV, but because it was close to Cal's room, had decided against it. She hadn't wanted to wake him. She had even debated waking Cass, but her friend had complained more than once about needing her beauty sleep before she had retired to her temporary quarters. Karras had given up his room, which had gone down well with Cass, mostly because it was as far from Diamond's room as she could get. In the end, Miranda had walked the grounds of the mansion, absorbing how beautiful the old building was as the sun rose higher. The wooden beams were such a contrast to the white panels set between them, and the gray-ribbed tile roof that swept up at each corner. The garden was just as beautiful, with all kinds of trees, and secret nooks and crannies filled with moss-covered boulders or stone lanterns. She meandered around the front garden, trailing her fingers over the huge stone lanterns, heading back towards the entrance porch of the house. Maybe she could crawl back under the covers and wake Cal up with a kiss so he would keep her company for a while. A strange, unsettling sensation bolted down her spine, and she frowned as she looked around the garden, seeking the source of it. She was alone. She lifted her head and scoured the block-shaped houses beyond the mansion's walls. Her gaze snagged on something on one of the rooftops and darted back to it. Cold slithered through her. Rage burned in her blood. The tallest of the two men casually tipped his hat, nodding his head at her. Miranda swore and took a step towards him and then stopped herself, jerking to a halt. It was what he wanted. He wanted to goad her, to lure her beyond the walls of the mansion. This was what they had been waiting for, and what she needed to do was go inside and tell Cal and Escher. The enemy was finally making their move. Her feet remained rooted to the spot, though, as that cold began to consume her, as the rage and fury condensed inside her, and the need for revenge rose to overwhelm her. She battled it, but it was strong, a living, writhing thing inside her. She couldn't surrender to it. She needed to raise the alarm. Her eyes widened as a purple-black cloud billowed behind the two men, twisting and swirling, spreading to fill a space taller and wider than they were. Violet and green sparks chased across it. The shorter man, Eli she presumed, stepped to one side and waved his hand in a flourish towards it, his other one gripping a wide black umbrella that cast shade upon him. The necromancer tipped his hat again and took a step back and disappeared into it. It was a portal. Miranda was moving before she could stop herself, the darker part of her in control as her heart pounded. She couldn't let them escape. The cold burned more fiercely inside her. The rage blazed hotter. She needed to stop them. This was the chance the brothers and she had been waiting for. She needed to avenge her father. Cal needed to avenge his sister and find a way to save her. She couldn't let them get away. She leaped over the wall, somehow easily clearing the 12-foot height of it, and landed in the street beyond. She kicked off, launching up into the air, and her heart lurched as she landed on a low roof. She could really jump. She didn't have a chance to muse that before she was moving again, the hunger for revenge driving her, making her leap to the next building and then kick off again, jumping onto the roof where the enemy was waiting. Eli stepped into the portal. Miranda stretched a hand out as she launched herself towards it, her other hand going to her jeans pocket, checking the phone Cal had given her was there. As soon as she was through, she would call Cal and tell him where she was. She'd dive through the portal, or at least she would describe where she thought she was. What if she didn't know the location? Black swirled around her, the cold inside her growing stronger as she readied herself. What if Cal didn't know it from her description? Fear gripped her. How many times had she thought Cal reckless? So much for careful planning. It turned out that her fury blood made her as reckless as he was when she felt her prey was in danger of getting away. Strength surged through her. She had been feeling more and more powerful each day, and she knew how to fight now. She was finally strong enough to have her vengeance. Nothing was going to stand in her way. But she wasn't alone in this fight. She hit grass and rolled across it, coming to a halt on her back in the shadow of a building she easily recognized as it speared the night sky. She sensed the two men nearby. Her hand flew to her pocket and she pulled the phone from it, fired off a message as the Wraith and Necromancer lunged for the device. It contained one word, Paris, and a lot of hope that Cal would receive it and send the cavalry, because the strength she had been feeling suddenly drained out of her as two other people crouched beside her and grabbed her arms. They hauled her onto her feet and she fought them, but her limbs felt weak and unresponsive. What was wrong with her? She glanced at the woman to her left and then the one on her right as Eli snatched the phone from her, dread pooling inside her as she spotted some unsettling similarities. Blonde hair, blue-green eyes. They even looked the same age as her. The other Irines. As the strength flowed out of her, darkness flowed in, great waves of it that bore down on her and had her slowly losing her fight against it. The power cycle. Thanatos had warned her about it. Why was it draining her, though?
Does she have what you want?
The necromancer nodded to Miranda as he looked at the women. The one on her left dipped her head.
She has it, just as you planned.
Just as you planned? Miranda looked at the man. His golden eyes seared her, and that need to fight rose within her, rage surging through her. But she barely had the strength to lift her head as another crushing wave of darkness pressed down on her, and her strength flowed from her. Into the other two Irines. The necromancer cautiously came to her, lifted his hand, and pressed his fingers to her chin, tipping her head up and supporting it.
I cannot take full credit for it. It was Eli who first mentioned the power of the Irines to me, but it was I who set in motion events that led to the capture of the females.
He tilted her head back further and gazed down at her, his eyes impassive, giving nothing away.
Your mother was always the most trouble. She always fought me.
He smiled softly.
She was my favorite.
He brushed his free hand down his jaw, over two silvery streaks on his skin, a strange light entering his eyes that almost resembled fondness.
I was angry when she escaped, but Eli and the others convinced me we could turn it to our advantage."
He shifted his hand and stroked the backs of his fingers over her cheek.
"I had hoped to find her before she gave birth to you, ending her life as her powers transferred to you, but the male hid her well. I had almost begun to worry I would never find you so I could awaken you."
Miranda swallowed hard. Her birth had killed her mother. Had her mother known it would happen? Had her father? She slowly shook her head as tears burned the backs of her eyes, the thought that her father had known she was going to kill the woman he had so dearly loved making her heart ache. She didn't know how he could have loved her after what she had done to her mother. The necromancer slowly canted his head to his left and stared deep into her eyes, his revealing pleasure. He was enjoying seeing her in pain. The bastard was savoring it. She narrowed her eyes on him, refusing to let him see the hurt he had caused her or the grief that still tore her apart whenever she thought about her father.
"A little push, and you would fall into the enemy's hands, and into your place in this grand plan."
The man tilted his head back and stared at the night sky.
"Now you have what I need, and the cycle of power between you will gift it to your sisters." "I'm not giving you anything."
She spat in his face as he lowered it towards her again, and he looked as if he wanted to strike her, but instead he gently sighed and wiped it away.
"We don't have much time,"
Eli said, the screen of her phone casting sickly pale light over his face, turning his eyes lilac and his hair as black as night.
"The message was sent. He will be coming."
The necromancer didn't look pleased to hear that.
"Very well. We shall move things along."
He motioned to Eli. Eli tossed her phone and cast another portal. The dark smoke spread like an ominous cloud above the grass, obscuring her view of the Eiffel Tower.
"Everything else is set."
The necromancer glanced at Eli. Eli pulled a phone from the pocket of his long black figure-hugging coat, checked it, and nodded.
"In motion, as planned."
What were they planning? Fear made her bold.
"The brothers will be here soon, just as you said. Just let me go now and maybe you'll live."
Eli grinned, revealing short fangs.
"If the young god is coming, he is coming alone."
"What does that mean?" She threw a panicked glance at her phone where it lay on the grass. Could she reach it and warn the brothers that the enemy was up to something? The necromancer pressed his hand to her cheek, keeping her eyes on him.
"I am afraid the wretched spawns of Hades have something of a pest problem at the gates. The things you can do with a few wards and some magic. Eli does wonderful work."
Eli tilted his head as the male looked at him and stepped through the portal. The necromancer turned back to her. Her pulse picked up.
"I won't go with you."
She struggled against the hold the two women had on her as the cycle poured power back into her, harnessing the darkness this time instead of fighting it. She twisted her arm and yanked the woman towards her, and hope bloomed inside her as she rocked her head forwards and cracked her brow against the woman's temple. The woman's grip loosened. The necromancer seized hold of Miranda's throat. She turned to glare on him and fought the women, mustering all of her strength as rage kindled once more, and the cold returned as his words rang in her mind, stoking her fury.
"A little push?" she bit out. "You murdered my father."
And he was going to pay for that. He chuckled softly as he pivoted and shoved her through the portal. His words echoed in the darkness, taunting her, weakening her.
"Murdered your father. I am your father."
Chapter 31. Cal woke to the sound of his phone vibrating and no Miranda. Where had she gone? How long had he been asleep? It felt like only minutes ago that he had drifted off with Miranda tucked safely in his arms. He scrubbed sleep from his eyes and fumbled for his phone, trying to find it on the tatami mats. He found it, lifted it, and squinted at the screen. The message was from Karis. Thanatos had contacted him to tell him something he had remembered about the Irines. They could siphon powers from others through physical contact. Cal flopped back onto the bedding. The surge in strength he had noticed in Miranda over the last few days suddenly made a lot of sense. She was more powerful because she had been stealing power from him. He pushed the covers off him, rose from the bed, and pulled his underwear on, following it with his jeans and a t-shirt. He needed to find Miranda and tell her about this power she had. He padded barefoot from the bedroom and yawned as he banked right. When he reached the end of the short corridor, he scanned the main living area. She wasn't there. Maybe she was in the garden. His phone buzzed again. He pulled it from his jeans. It was probably another message from one of his brothers. He frowned. It was from Miranda. One word. Paris. Paris? His stomach sank. His senses stretched around him, charting the vicinity. Within the grounds of the mansion, he could only detect 4 signatures. Him, Escher, Iko, Cass. His pulse surged, heart slamming against his ribs as he sprinted towards the doors to the garden and slid the panels open. He scoured the garden, frowning against the brightening sunlight, sure Miranda was there and he was just tired. The same result. Only 4 people, including himself. He looked down at his phone again. Paris. Did that mean she was in Paris? It wasn't possible. None of his brothers would have teleported her without waking him and making him aware of what was happening. Unless. The weight in his stomach doubled, had him closing his eyes as he breathed. No. Darkness rushed through him, causing his canines to transform into short fangs, and he snarled as he teleported to the front porch, shoved his feet into his boots, and stepped again. To Paris. He landed on top of the Arc de Triomphe, his heart thundering, blood rushing. Where in Paris would the enemy take her? His eyes slowly widened. Irines could siphon powers. He didn't need to search for her. He knew exactly where the enemy would take her, because there was a chance she could now open the gates. He looked up at the dark sky and cursed. The time difference between Tokyo and Paris meant the bastards had most of the night ahead of them. He cursed himself for letting the darker side of his nature take control when he should have taken a moment to think things through, or at the very least speak to his brothers. Karis was going to rip him a new one about running off without backup. But Miranda was in danger. He could feel it in his gut, like a sword through his heart, and he needed to find her. He fired off a message to everyone, hoping they would think he had sent it before rushing headlong into a fight alone, but aware all of them would know he had been reckless. Again. Only this time he wasn't the only one who had leaped before looking. Maybe Miranda could siphon more than powers and had absorbed the worst of his personality traits, too. A message rolled in from Ares. Be right there. Valen's message would have made him smile if the situation had been any less grave. Takes balls to hit that gate. Kudos to the fuckers. Cal couldn't agree more. Attempting to take down the Paris gate was seriously stepping up their game. Not only was Paris the gate that Karis protected, but it was the second most powerful. If the enemy could get it open, it would cause mayhem in the world, upsetting the careful balance between the realms. The fallout would be devastating, and would make it more difficult for him and his brothers to protect the other gates and stop them from falling. It only took either Tokyo or Paris, the 2 oldest gates, being shattered to cause a ripple effect across all the other gates. The enemy must have figured out which gate was bound to which of his brothers by researching their age. Cal could only hope that he could reach the gate in time, and that he had the power to keep the enemy busy long enough for his brothers to arrive. He stepped again, aware that teleporting would drain his strength, but needing to get to Miranda and the gate as soon as possible. When the darkness receded, he stood in the middle of the square before the white basilica of the Sacré-Cœur. Hope bled from him when colorful light shimmered across the square in front of the basilica, and he lifted his head, his eyes landing on the gate that hovered at the edge of the terrace. Only 3 rings had opened, each of them filling the air between him and the panoramic view of Paris. This was the only gate that stood vertical rather than horizontal, and as it slowly grew in size, it began to obscure the city beyond it. His gaze sought Miranda as he mustered his strength, aware he was going to need all of it as his gut swirled, his sharp senses pinpointing not only the wraith nearby, but the Necromancer too. And 2 others. 2 who were fighting to restrain Miranda, wrestling with her as she struggled, attempting to break free of their hold as they grappled with her, keeping her facing the gate. The 2 blonde females had to be the other Irines. which meant they were now using the cycle of power that linked them to steal Miranda's ability to open the gate. The outside ring of the gate shrank slightly. If she had enough time, could Miranda close it? He wasn't sure, but he had to try to buy her that time regardless. Miranda bit out a rather ripe curse that was unlike her and managed to yank her right arm free. She backhanded the woman on that side of her. The woman bared her teeth, her violet eyes bright as she seized hold of Miranda again and hissed at her. The instinct to draw the air to him and blast the two bitches with it was strong, but he suppressed it, aware that if he sent them flying, Miranda was liable to go flying with them. He wouldn't be able to live with himself if he hurt her. He wasn't sure how strong she was. She could take blows, but her body bruised and bled as easily as a mortal's did. If he accidentally sent her over the edge of the hill with the other two Furies, there was no way of knowing if she would survive the fall.
"Stop fighting us. It won't achieve anything."
One of the women wrestled Miranda back under control. Cal growled, "Keep fighting, Mari." Miranda stiffened and looked over her shoulder, beyond Eli and the Necromancer to him.
"Cal."
"I'm here. Gonna get you out of this. Just keep trying to close that gate. I'll help you." That didn't go down well with Eli or the Necromancer. He kept his eyes off the hellspawn, aware that if he looked at him, there was a chance the rage burning inside him, the need for justice and to avenge his sister, would seize control of him, or that his memories would hit him and he would black out. Miranda needed him awake and fighting, so he kept his eyes firmly away from the Necromancer's face as he said, "Tell me where my sister's soul is being held." The male chuckled.
"She died too easily, and then you resisted death. It wasn't exactly my finest hour. Nothing went according to plan. She should have lived a little longer, just enough to ensure your mind and soul had been shattered enough to complete the next step of the plan."
The next step? He snarled and bared emerging fangs when it hit him. "You wanted me to take my own life." The male softly chuckled again.
"It would have been beautiful. Your parents were devastated by her death. Imagine what would have happened if you had done as I had planned."
It would have torn his family apart. It would have given his father's enemies the chance to rise up against him and tear him down. Something else struck him. That plan had failed, and in its place the Necromancer and his cohorts had devised another one, something far more dramatic. Destroying the gates to weaken Hades and the underworld and form a new realm they could rule. Rage blazed a path through Cal, drawing out his darker side, stoking it until he couldn't hold himself back. His brothers would be here any moment, but he couldn't stand here and let these two bastards open the gate. Time was against him. He had to act now.
"Cal, the other gates!"
Miranda's voice cut off in a grunt, and he glared at the Fury who had smashed an elbow into her stomach. What about the other gates? The cold smile that stretched Eli's lips said it all, but part of him still refused to believe it. In Seville, the Wraith had used some sort of magic to force the gate open once it had started appearing. Paris wasn't the only gate under attack. The Wraith must have used the Oriones and their power to trigger more gates, setting traps for his brothers.
"No one is coming to save you this time. I made sure of that."
The Necromancer's words rolled over him, stoking the fury blazing inside Cal. He should have known the Necromancer and Wraith would have a plan, one designed to split him and his brothers up. How many other gates were under attack right now?
"My last plan failed, but this time I will succeed. How will your family react when you die here and we breach the gate?"
Cal refused to think about that. He wasn't going to die here. He wasn't going to fail in his duty. His brothers would be here soon. He had to trust them and believe in them just as they believed in him. He could do this. He launched at Eli, aware that he needed the Necromancer alive. He hated that, but he couldn't risk killing the male. He needed to know where Calendria's soul was being held. The black-haired Wraith leaped backwards, his long onyx coat flaring around his legs, as he placed some distance between them. The male's purple eyes brightened in the low light, the colors of the gate shimmering over the side of his face as he sneered at Cal. Eli drew a blade, one that had a violet gleam. Cal couldn't risk letting that blade cut him. It was toxic, would weaken him. If he was weakened, he flicked a glance at Miranda. She continued to struggle against the two furies, her gaze locked on the gate as it wavered, the outermost ring shrinking and expanding depending on who had the upper hand at that moment. She wasn't strong enough to close it when it was 2 against 1. He focused on the gate too, using his connection to it to boost her efforts, commanding it to close as he shifted his gaze back to Eli. The Necromancer grabbed him from behind and Cal twisted, throwing him over his shoulder. The male hit the pavement in front of Cal, and Cal made the mistake of looking at him. He stared down into golden eyes. Pain erupted across his skull, and he clutched his head with both hands as he staggered backwards and tried to shake it off.
"Get it open!"
the Necromancer barked.
"She's tiring!"
One of the females grabbed Miranda by her hair and yanked her head back, tearing a cry from her. Cal's every instinct commanded him to go to her. He stepped. Eli blocked his path as he appeared, slammed a hand against his chest, and sent him flying across the square. Cal grunted as he crashed into a stone pillar, bellowed in agony as he bent backwards over it and landed flat on his face on the other side. He picked himself up and ran at Eli, wishing he had taken a moment to arm himself with his blades and aware that he couldn't risk another teleport. Each one drained him, and he needed that strength to fight. He skidded to a halt. Eli glared at him. What was he doing? Cal drew down a deep breath and focused, trying to wrestle his rage back under control, seeking calm as he tried to center himself. He needed to focus, needed to harness all of his abilities. The air stirred, teasing the tips of his ponytail, causing the long hem of Eli's form-fitting black coat to flutter around his ankles. Air was all around him, his element. It was inside his foes, too. He could use that against them. He wavered as he thought about that. He couldn't. What if he killed them? Eli and this Necromancer had valuable information. He couldn't kill them, but he could knock them out. He had never tried it before. There was a danger that he might go too far. He shifted his focus to beyond Eli, his gaze landing on one of the Furies, the perfect test subject. He reached with his power, sought the air around her, slowly seized control of it as it flowed into her lungs. He commanded it to stop before it reached them, held it lodged in her throat as she gasped. She released Miranda and clutched at her throat. "Deal with him!" Eli rushed to the female. The Necromancer grinned coldly, and the shadow the lamps dotted around the square cast at his feet writhed. Inky black bled from his dark trousers and leather shoes, mingling with the shadow. It twisted and contorted, and 1,000 screams filled the air as it rushed towards Cal. Black spikes shot up from the shadow as it rolled towards him, tendrils of it racing ahead only for others to pass them. Cal leaped to his right before it could hit him, grimaced as he landed and rolled into a crouch and looked back at where he had been. A writhing, hissing mass of shadows loomed there, taking on a shape. Almost human. It lumbered towards him and leaned its head to its left and its right at the same time. The head split down the middle, and then the body separated, and 2 shadows loomed before him. The second shadow looked as if it would split again. Eli barked, "You dare defile her like that!" The Necromancer flicked an unrepentant look at the male, and then slowly bowed his head. "Very well." Cal wasn't sure what they were arguing about until the shadowy figures began to take on a more defined shape. One of them grew wings and curves, and ghostly color like a faded photograph, and Cal recognized her. The Valkyrie. Eli had feared the Necromancer would use Lisabetta's soul in the fight. His gaze leaped to the other shadow. It was male, had glowing green-white eyes with black surrounding them. Jagged streaks of blue lightning emerged against that obsidian backdrop as his black lips curved into a wicked smile that exposed sharp teeth. Cal didn't know this one, but he guessed it was another of the enemies fallen. Cal lashed at both of them with his wind, not willing to let them near him. The blast cut straight through them rather than sending them flying as intended. The shadows they were made from swirled and twisted, knitting back together. Damn. The 2 came at him at once, and he brought both of his forearms up in front of his face and blocked as the male hurled a punch at him. The shadowy fist struck him hard, and Cal had to brace a foot behind him as he was shoved backwards. He recovered quickly and lashed out at him. snarled when his fist went straight through the bastard. That wasn't fair. If Cal couldn't hit them, he would just have to focus his fight elsewhere. He summoned the air, condensing it around his fist, and launched it towards the wraith. The spiral of wind, twisting like a tornado, shot across the terrace, rushing past the necromancer. The male hurled himself to one side, leaving Eli open. The funnel hit Eli, and the male bared his fangs on a pained snarl as he shot backwards. A violet-black portal rapidly formed in the air behind him, and he disappeared into it. Cal waited, sure the bastard was going to make an appearance again. His senses sharpened, anticipation coiling inside him as he braced himself. The two shadows chose that moment to attack him as one, forcing him backwards, and he fought them off, hitting them with spears of air that blasted holes in them. They recovered from each one, the black smoke knitting back together, but they were slowing. He risked a glance at the necromancer. Sweat dotted the male's brow. Hurting the shadows was hurting him, because he had to keep funneling power into them to repair them. Cal growled and attacked them harder, blasting them in rapid succession, hitting them with dozens of tiny bursts of air like bullets. Hope began to grow as he glanced at Miranda and saw the outermost ring of the gate was smaller now, almost completely gone. They could do this, together. Fire burned in his right side. Eli whispered from behind him, "You never did learn to guard your back." Images flashed across Cal's mind, a rapid-fire burst of them that had his head spinning, as pain spread outwards from the point above his hip, white-hot flames crawling over his skin to steal his breath, and his strength. He saw the underworld, saw a small village, saw his sister. She squatted beside him, her face dirty, sky-blue dress stained with black around her ankles as she eyed the collection of huts. He needed to get her away from this place, and there was a chance that the villagers could help them, could somehow get word to his father. But there was an equal chance they would attack them. The last village they had come across had done such a thing. He focused on what was ahead of him, aware that he had to try the village. "Wait here." He stood, and Calindria seized his wrist. Her blue eyes were luminous as she looked up at him, her pale eyebrows furrowed. She was afraid. He smoothed his fingers across her cheek and smiled, concealing the fact he was afraid too. He didn't know what was going to happen. He only knew that he needed her safe, away from this place. To do that, he had to try to find someone who could help them, even when it was risky, dangerous. If he had to fight to keep her safe, to get her home, he would fight until his very last breath. "Brother," she whispered, as soft as a summer breeze, love and fear in her eyes. "Let me come with you." He shook his head. "It's too dangerous. Stay here. Stay hidden. No matter what." She hesitated for the longest time before she eventually nodded. He took a step back. Fire blazed in his side, and he looked down, his eyebrows knitting as wetness spread across his stomach. "What?" He blinked, slowly edged his left hand towards his right side and fingered the strange point in his dirty black tunic, flinched as something sharp sliced through it. "Brother!" Calindria surged to her feet, her eyes wild as she hurled herself at him and grabbed his shoulders, pulling him towards her. A grunt fell from his lips as something sliced through his side, filling the thick air with a wet sucking sound. He collapsed to his knees, landing against Calindria and taking her down with him. She held him as fire burned through him, her words wobbling in his ears as his head spun, twisting so violently he wanted to vomit. He focused, managing to snag a few words a male said to her. "First lesson, always watch your back." Cal collapsed to his knees on the terrace of the basilica, struggling to shake off the effects of the memories and the poison that laced the wraith's blade. Eli was the one who had captured him and Calindria. He had been the one to take her soul. Cal snarled and shot to his feet, twisting to face the wraith at the same time. He seized the demon's throat and squeezed, pain and fury burning through him, stealing his control from him. The wraith would pay for what he had done to her. But what if the wraith was the only one who knew how to find her? He faltered, that thought stealing his strength as he stared at the male. "Get off me!" Miranda's voice, laced with fear and pain, had that strength pouring back into him. He needed to protect her. He wouldn't let these fiends take her from him, and if he didn't fight, that was going to happen. He threw Eli away from him and looked across at the gate. It was opening again. A fourth ring had appeared. Miranda was losing the fight against the Furies. She needed his help. The Necromancer moved to stand between him and Miranda, a cold edge to his smile, a look in his eyes that dared Cal to make a move. Eli joined him. The two shadows flanked Cal, the male waiting 15 feet to his right and the Valkyrie at a similar distance on his left. Cal clamped a hand down over his side and focused, using a gift that had felt like a curse his entire life. The wounds slowly knit back together, the power to heal that came from his mother purging the toxin from him. How many times had he cursed this gift? It had been a torment when it had awakened inside him during his captivity, discovered by accident when he had come close to giving up and had rested his hands in his lap. The wound on his left thigh that had been gushing blood had healed before his eyes. Hope had soared. He had crawled to Calendria and tried to heal her too, only his power hadn't worked on her. It had only worked on him. It only ever worked on him. He stared down the demon and the hellspawn, deeply aware that he wasn't going to win this fight, not if he continued to hold back. He was pulling his punches, afraid of accidentally dealing a killing blow to either Eli or the Necromancer. Another ring emerged on the gate, flashing bright blue before it swirled with color and glyphs appeared around it. If he killed these men without forcing the location of his sister's soul from them, it would be released, but he wouldn't know where it was. The chances of him being able to locate it and guide it to the Elysian fields would be slim to none. He looked at the gate, and then at Miranda as she desperately struggled against the Arines, her movements weak now, sluggish. Cal stared at her, his heart aching, breaking in two as he stood there, torn. The Necromancer was too powerful for him to defeat without going all out, had clearly been feeding on all the deaths of his allies, and was able to summon those allies as shadows to fight for him. The Arines were powerful too, and Eli was a force to be reckoned with, his blade a danger that could easily tip the scales in the enemy's favor. Cal couldn't heal himself on the fly. He would need time and space the enemy wouldn't give him again. He could see that in Eli's violet eyes. Cal wavered, pulled in two directions, battling with himself as he tried to find a solution. There was only one. He needed to keep the gates safe, needed to protect the underworld and this realm, and he needed to save Miranda. To do that, he had to eliminate those standing in his way, the Necromancer included. Wind slowly built around him, a gentle breeze that rapidly became a hurricane, fueled by his pain, by his misery, by the hope that bled from him, because to succeed in that mission, he had to fail in another. He closed his eyes, pressed a hand to his chest over his heart, and silently asked his sister to forgive him. He would find her somehow. He wouldn't stop searching for her soul. He wouldn't rest until she was safe at last, even if it took him the rest of his days. Warmth bloomed beneath his feet, giving him strength, courage. He flicked his eyes open and locked them on the Necromancer, unsure whether he was strong enough to take him down, but sure of one thing as he focused all of his will on it. He would stop the gate from opening and protect it. His eyes narrowed on the hellspawn. He would save Miranda. Chapter 32. Calistos made a straight lunge for the Necromancer, his eyes locked with the male's golden ones as they shone in the low light. Beyond him, the gate flashed brightly, color dancing across the rings as the largest of them began to shrink. The shadowy male and female appeared between him and the Necromancer. The female launched a hand at him, claws raking through the air where his shoulder had been as he dodged left, narrowly evading her attack. The male was waiting for him, the lightning that blazed outwards from his ghostly green eyes flaring as he snarled. The sound echoed strangely, seemed to reverberate in Cal's head as he swept his hand upwards. Air followed in the wake of it, a whip of wind that sliced through the shadow male before he could attack. The Necromancer grunted and shoved his hand forwards. The Valkyrie attacked Cal, relentlessly striking at him with her claws, driving him back again as the shadow male recovered, his form knitting back together. Miranda screamed, the pained sound ripping at his focus. He flicked a glance at her as he hurled his hand towards the Valkyrie, sending 4 twisting needles of air at her. Miranda wrestled with the 2 blonde females, shoving one and yanking on the other, but they quickly subdued her, their fingers pressing hard into her arms and digging into her hair. The ring of the gate began to expand again. Cal cursed. If he didn't do something, the gate was going to open. Miranda was doing her best, but she wasn't strong enough to fight alone. He could feel the fear in her, the doubts that were holding her back. Cal mustered his strength and risked a teleport, desperation driving him. He had to reach Miranda and get her away from the Furies. Someone collared him the moment he appeared, a cold hand closing around the back of his neck. Sharp claws pierced his skin, and he howled in agony as he was flipped over their head and slammed into the ground face first. Air exploded from his lungs, and he gasped, struggling to remain conscious as the one holding him shoved him into the ground. His throat burned, spine aching. If he didn't do something, he was going to pass out. He lashed at the one holding him, using spirals of air to barrage the male. The thick scent of blood laced the air, and the pressure on his neck disappeared. The blood wasn't demon. He sprang to his feet and looked at the Necromancer. The male growled as he shirked out of his ruined black suit jacket and looked at the lacerations in his onyx dress shirt. The Necromancer held his hand out, and shadows flowed into his fingers. The wounds beneath his shirt healed before Cal's eyes. Apparently, Cal wasn't the only one who could heal on the fly. Pain exploded in a sickening wave as the Necromancer appeared before him, and his fist plowed into Cal's stomach, lifting him off the floor and sending him sailing through the air. His lungs burned again, and fire swept across his back as he landed hard. Pain spiderwebbed across his skull as the back of it hit the flagstones. Miranda cried, "Cal!" He shook off the blow. His vision cleared just in time for him to see the Shadow Valkyrie diving towards him. She struck him hard, barreling into his stomach, sending a fresh wave of pain crashing over him. He tried to grapple with her, but his hands passed straight through her. Her claws sliced him, though, shredding his t-shirt and the flesh beneath. On a vicious snarl, he sent a wall of wind at her. It hit her hard, sent her flying to his left. He placed a hand on his stomach and used a little more juice, just enough healing power to speed the process along. He couldn't risk using too much. It weakened him, and he needed his strength. The Necromancer was going to be harder to defeat than he had thought. The male was too strong, hit like one of the gargantuan gatekeepers. Attacking him head-on was a suicide mission. Not only was the male powerful, but his shadows were powerful too. Cal paused, frowned as he recalled what had happened when he had attacked the shadowy figures. It had weakened the Necromancer. If he could deal enough damage to them, would it leave the Necromancer drained? Was damaging them the same as damaging him? It was worth a shot. He summoned his power, drawing the air to him, forming a wall around the area that would rip anything that went near it to pieces, especially the shadows. It took effort to maintain the barrier, but he could use it to his advantage in other ways. It was a pool of air that he could use to attack his enemies from any angle, without having to focus too much, which meant he wouldn't give away when he was about to attack. The shadow male came at him again, but Cal didn't give him a chance to close the gap. He launched 3 javelins of air at the male. 2 speared him, cleaving great holes in his shoulder and hip. The 3rd missed. The thing howled but didn't back off. It came at him, sprinting across the flagstones as it healed. Cal pulled another 5 missiles from the wall of wind, launching them at the shadow. Each one that hit the male forced him backwards, away from Cal, leaving holes in the shadows and the pavement where they lodged into it before dissipating. The Necromancer grunted. The Valkyrie attacked. Cal hurled himself into a roll, avoiding the blow the shadowy female aimed at him, and came up onto his feet. He pivoted and threw his hands towards her. She dodged each shaft of air that rocketed towards her, too fast for him to easily track. The Necromancer was upping his game. Cal drew more missiles from the wall of wind that whipped around them, summoning a dozen that he hurled at her in a stream he could control. She couldn't dodge all of them. She evaded the first 2 as she came at him, but he countered her, predicting where she would appear next. The next one cleaved right through her thigh, and she hissed as she leaped away, into the path of another. It pierced her chest, and she staggered backwards. The remaining spears of air punched holes in her, and she collapsed onto her back as a masculine grunt reached Cal's ears. He glanced at the Necromancer, grinned as he saw the sweat dotting his brow and how pale he looked as he held his right hand out in front of him.
"Get her under control and get that open,"
the male snarled from between clenched teeth. Cal's gaze flicked beyond him to Miranda. She had broken free of one of the Irines and was wrestling with the other one. One of the rings on the gate shrank back into it and disappeared. It was closing. Cal's grin stretched wider as hope soared. They could do this. Or maybe not. Eli raised his hands before him, his palms facing the gate, and muttered words. 5 points of light appeared around the outer ring of the gate, swirling violet orbs streaked with green that flashed as they began to expand. Power charged the air, vibrating in Cal's stomach, and he cursed low. He had witnessed how easily the Wraith had been able to command the gate with that spell, and he couldn't let the male complete it. He needed to reach the bastard and stop him somehow. The two shadowy figures turned to ribbons of darkness that flowed through the air, funneling back into the Necromancer. Cal turned his focus on him as Miranda fought the remaining fury, desperately lashing out with her free hand as she tried to twist free of her grip. He sent a spiral of air shooting towards Eli. It coiled around the demon, and the 5 points of light dulled as the Wraith focused on freeing himself from it. Miranda slammed a fist into the Fury's face, but the other one made a lunge for her.
"Get her back under control,"
the Necromancer barked. Cal launched at the male's back. Apparently, he wasn't the only one who forgot to guard it. His fist slammed into the center of the male's back, sending him staggering forwards. Shadows launched from around his feet, lashing and snapping at Cal. Cold fire burned wherever they managed to touch him, an icy chill that seemed to sap his strength, as if the Necromancer was stealing the life from him with those blows. Cal made a mental note to avoid the shadows as best he could. He lifted his gaze to lock it on the Necromancer. It snagged on Eli as he broke through the barrier of wind between him and Miranda as it weakened, affected by the drain the Necromancer's shadows had on Cal's power. No. Eli grabbed Miranda by her hair and hauled her backwards, pressed his blade to her throat before she could fight him. She sat on her knees, her head tipped back, her skin pale as she tried to look down at the blade poised beneath her chin.
"I don't need you to be compliant or on our side. You can provide us with the power we need even if you're a captive. We just need you breathing."
Eli bent his head and brought his lips to her ear, his violet eyes on Cal as he grinned.
"Although I will enjoy keeping you barely alive, making you pay for what your wretched gods did to my Lisabetta."
Her eyes widened, leaped to Cal. Fear flooded them, fear that reached out to him and roused the darkness, had him roaring as he launched towards her, determined to reach her and free her, to save her. Regret flared in her eyes, too. He wanted to tell her that this wasn't her fault, that he knew she was sorry she had gone after them alone, and that he wasn't angry with her because he would have done the same. They were both driven by a thirst for vengeance. He stepped, appearing behind the Wraith, and seized the arm he held the blade in. He twisted it, ripping a grunt from Eli, and slammed his hand into the male's other shoulder, forcing it forwards. Miranda scrambled away from the demon and swore as the two Furies lunged for her. Cal wrestled with Eli, fighting to keep him contained. Eli twisted forwards, managed to bring his elbow up and reared back, slamming it into Cal's face. Blood burst from his nose, running over his lips, and heat spread across his cheeks, but he refused to release the demon. He dug short claws into the male's wrist and kept on bending, turning it and trying to force him to drop his blade. The demon's hand finally opened and the knife tumbled from it. Cal mustered all of his strength and pivoted, hurled the Wraith away from him and Miranda. He swept his hand forwards, sending a wave of wind at Eli that hit him square in the chest and lifted him from the ground. The Wraith flew through the air, and this time he didn't get the chance to summon a portal. He hit the wall of wind and was whipped around by it and slammed into the ground, only to be picked up again by the tornado and hurled once more. Eli bellowed, the vicious sound blending with the roar of the wind. Cal flinched when the male hit the ground again, this time tumbling across the flagstones to land on his back a short distance from the Necromancer. One down. Cal narrowed his eyes on the hellspawn who had moved to stand between him and the Furies. blocking his path to Miranda. 1 to go. Shadows suddenly snaked around Cal's legs, twisting tightly as they surged upwards. Icy cold flooded his veins, sapping his strength, and the tendrils of darkness pulled him down, forcing him to his knees before the Necromancer. The male stared down at him, his golden eyes emotionless, expression giving nothing away. Cal gritted his teeth, fought the shadows, and tried to break free, but the more he fought them, the tighter they bound him. As they pulled him down, forcing his chest against the ground, so his cheek pressed to the flagstones, the Necromancer chuckled. A cold, hollow sound. It stoked a fire inside Cal, flames that had him burning, twisting his wrists against the shadows. He wouldn't give up. The Necromancer's polished shoes came into view. The male pressed the left one to Cal's shoulder and pushed him over onto his back. He stared down at Cal. Those golden eyes had looked at him that way before. He was bone-deep aware of it as he stared into them, chilled to his marrow, his strength leeching from him, devoured by the shadows that shackled him. The Necromancer smiled coldly. "This time you die." Cal swallowed and stared at his death. He had failed everyone again, and this time no one was going to save him. Chapter 33. "Get her under control and get that open!" The Necromancer's deep voice rolled like thunder over the terrace as Miranda twisted free of the grip of the woman on her right. Her body ached, every muscle threatening to cramp, but she kept fighting. She couldn't give up. She had come here and had caused this mess, and she was going to fix it, somehow. She wrestled with the other fury, her focus torn between fighting her and fighting the gate. It was hard to keep part of it on the gate, but she had to keep attempting to close it, or at least stop it from opening fully. If battling to close it was draining her, fighting to open it had to be draining the other furies too. If she could just hold on long enough and keep on resisting them, she would be able to get free. The black-haired man in the long obsidian coat came to her, halting a short distance away, and hope bled from her as he raised his hands and mumbled words. She felt a shift in power and looked up at the gate. 5 orbs of light appeared around the outer ring, and the gate began to expand again, and this time she couldn't stop it. No. She gritted her teeth and fought whatever power the wraith was funneling into the gate, refusing to give up as she wrestled with the remaining fury. She had to stop him. Wind whipped around the wraith and he reared back, glaring at it as it spun like a vortex, pinning his hands to his sides. Cal. He was giving her the time she needed. The power she had felt weakened and she focused on the gate, on closing it before the wraith could escape the funnel of wind. She gritted her teeth and attacked the fury, clawing at her arm and drawing blood. The woman hissed and lashed out at her, but the attack was weak. Miranda grinned. She put all of her strength into a right hook. Her fist connected hard with the woman's jaw, and she fell sideways, her grip on Miranda failing. Before the other fury could grab her, Miranda sprang to her feet and stumbled forwards. Eli broke free of the vortex, seized her by her hair, and hauled her backwards. She gasped as her knees hit the ground with jarring force, and he yanked her head back, exposing her throat. The cold kiss of his blade had her stilling as fear flooded her. All thought of fighting draining from her as she kept her head tipped up, all of her awareness fixed on the knife poised to cut her throat. "I don't need you to be compliant or on our side. You can provide us with the power we need even if you're a captive. We just need you breathing." Eli bent his head and brought his lips to her ear. "Although I will enjoy keeping you barely alive, making you pay for what your wretched gods did to my Lisabetta." Her eyes widened, leaped to Cal. She didn't know who Lisabetta was, but she imagined that she was dead, and that Eli's way of making her pay would be horrific, a torment that would destroy Miranda. Her pulse hammered in her throat, her heart skipping a beat as she stared at Cal, as fear swamped her. She shouldn't have let her instincts control her. She should have woken Cal and told him about the men. She should have waited for them to make another move. Instead of all that, she had thrown herself into the fray and placed this world and the underworld in danger. And she was sorry she had done it. His stormy blue eyes warmed, offering reassurances that she greedily devoured, even when the barest thread of hope that she had been holding on to snapped. She wasn't making it out of this. Cal disappeared and she felt his presence behind her, that comforting sense of home that soothed her turbulent soul and had strength and courage bleeding back into her again. Eli's blade disappeared from her throat and she scrambled forwards on her hands and knees, getting away from him as fast as she could when her entire body was quaking, weak. Fear sank icy claws into her heart and squeezed as the two furies lunged for her. She fought them as best she could, using her claws and fists, and even her feet to keep them off her. Eli went flying, was caught up in the whirling wall of wind that enclosed them, and roared as he hit the ground. One of the furies managed to snag her wrist, and she cried out as the woman twisted her arm behind her back, forcing her to bend forwards to avoid it being ripped out of its socket. The other fury was swift to grab her too, seizing the opening she had been given. Damn it! The necromancer loomed between her and Cal, and she wanted to scream at him to move as shadows zoomed outwards from beneath the man, rocketing towards Cal. He didn't notice them quickly enough. They snaked around his legs and pulled him down. Her heart lodged in her throat. Acid poured through her veins. Cal fought the shadows that twined around him, but more seized him, dragging him down face first against the ground. The necromancer stood over him, pressed a foot to his shoulder, and shoved him onto his back. The dark-haired man stared down at Cal, and a slow smile stretched his lips. "This time you die." Cal swallowed and just stared at him. The acid in her veins burst into flames, and strength surged through her, power that flooded every inch of her, awakening her tired muscles, restoring her and then pushing her body beyond how strong she normally felt. On a roar she didn't recognize as coming from herself, she surged to her feet and tore the furies off her. She grabbed one by her throat and hurled her at the necromancer, surprised by her own strength as the woman shot through the air and slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. The man shoved the fury off him, pressed his hands to the flagstones, and looked at her, his golden eyes wide and filled with surprise that echoed inside Miranda. She was seriously powerful. The broken threads of her hope wove back together as she faced the necromancer, as she focused on the gate behind her and commanded it to close. The man bared teeth at her on a low growl as the gate began to shrink. He shoved to his feet, and Miranda didn't need to try to remember her training this time. It just came to her as she embraced her powers, no longer afraid of them as she called on that side of herself so she could save Cal. It was as if she had been fighting her entire life. She hunkered down and kicked off, heard stone crack as she launched towards the necromancer. The man's golden eyes narrowed on her, and he braced himself. She plowed into him, lifting his feet off the ground and heaving him into the air, pressed a hand to his chest and shoved, slamming him back into the flagstones. Breath exploded from him, sprayed her with blood. The cold, vicious part of her howled for more, to spill it in rivers to make him pay for attempting to take Cal from her, to make him pay for killing her father. Eli tackled her, and she grunted as she hit the ground with him on top of her. She lashed out at him with her claws, and the hum of power in the air grew, thickened to press down on her. A hand clamped down on Eli's shoulder, black nails pressing into his coat. Eli flew off her, soaring into the night sky, and disappeared. Cass smiled down at her, her fall of silky black hair hanging forwards as she leaned over.
"You are in a lot of trouble, little lady. It is way past your bedtime."
Miranda had never been so relieved to see her friend. Cass grabbed her hand and pulled her onto her feet, and she realized it wasn't only Cass who had come to help. Diamond and Escher were fighting the Furies and the Necromancer, shielding Cal as he hauled himself onto his feet, his eyes stormier than she had ever seen them. "The others are dealing with Rome and London. Seems we beat them here. Don't know what these guys were thinking, but who tries to attack a gate at sunrise?" Diamond cast a glance at Escher, streaks of black blood cutting across the left side of his face and darkening his white hair. Escher didn't take his near-black eyes off the sky. Was he waiting for the wraith to appear? Cal wiped the back of his hand across his nose, clearing the blood away. "Took you guys long enough." Diamond shrugged, rolling his shoulders beneath his tight black long-sleeved top, and then cracked his knuckles. Frost glittered over his leather gloves, drawing her focus there. He reached his left hand under his right arm and smiled slowly as he pulled a short knife free of a holster he wore. The wall of wind dropped as Cal narrowed his gaze on the Necromancer. Things were looking up. He regretted thinking that as violet-black oval portals appeared around them, 6 of them in total, and demons poured out of them. Eli had used his brief reprieve to bring reinforcements. She stared at the 4 dozen demons as they swarmed the square, her heart shooting into her throat. Fear began as a trickle in her veins that swiftly became a torrent that had her strength faltering. Cal and his brothers moved so their backs were to each other as the demons closed in, and Cass wrapped an arm around her, tucking her close. She could feel Cass's nerves, her fear. It fueled Miranda's own, and no matter how fiercely she fought it, the doubts began to crowd her mind. They were outnumbered 10-1. The threads of her hope began to unravel again. How could they possibly win now? Chapter 34. Adrenaline surged through Cal, pulling power in its wake as he faced off against the horde of demons, his back plastered against Escher's and Diamond close to his side. He flicked a glance at Miranda, checking on her. Cass protectively clutched her with one hand, and twisting crimson and aqua orbs spiraled around the other as she held it in front of her, casting colorful light over her long black dress. He caught the fear in Miranda's violet eyes, the doubt. She thought this was bad? He smiled at her, wanting to show her that he had lived through worse. She looked at him as if he had gone mad. Maybe he had, because he was facing 50 powerful enemies and he had never felt more alive. With his brothers at his side and Cass and Miranda on the field, he felt as if he could take on everything the enemy had to throw at him. "Get that open," the Necromancer said, his golden gaze leaping towards the gate. Miranda moved before Cal could even think about trying to stop the wraith as he appeared out of a portal near the gate, one of the Furies dangling from his left hand. He shoved her towards the other Fury and turned on Miranda, his voice a low snarl as he spoke to the 2 women huddled together behind him. "You heard him. Open it, now." Eli raised his hands towards the portal, and the 5 orbs of light brightened again and began to stretch, growing pointed and flaring at times, as if they wanted to elongate into violet-green beams. "Damn it," Cal growled. "Escher, shut him down."
"Take 5, beast. This is my dance."
Cass held her left hand up, earning a growl from Escher as he stared over the heads of the demons crowding the square between him and the wraith. The witch raised her right hand, palm facing the gate, and uttered low words. Whatever she was doing, it was working. The 5 points of light dulled and flickered, almost fading entirely before they sparked back to life.
"Oh, don't be such a bothersome creature. Fighting me really won't get you anywhere."
She cast a cold smile at Eli. "You're telling me," Diamond muttered. Cass glared at him. The witch hurled her left hand forwards, and the orbs that had been swirling around it flew at the wraith, still spiraling around each other. They raced past Miranda as she charged at him. Cal didn't get the chance to see if they hit their target. 3 demons lunged for him, stealing his focus. He hit them all with a blast of wind, knocking them back into the others, and looked at Diamond. "We have to stop them from opening that gate," he bit out, unable to focus on it as he commanded the air, using rapid blasts of it to keep the demons at bay. "Care to volunteer to assist your new girlfriend?" "The only girlfriend here is your one," Diamond snapped. "You go." Shadows danced around the feet of the demons, shadows Cal didn't like. The Necromancer wanted them to get close to him and his brothers so those shadows would have a chance to seize hold of them. At close quarters, they wouldn't be able to evade them. "Just try to close it, will you?" Cal barked as he used his wind to knock several demons back. "Fine, I'll try." Diamond launched shards of ice at the demons, and Cal hit them with a burst of wind, sending them rocketing towards their targets. Only one of them hit a demon, sending the female to her knees as she cried out and clutched the clear blade protruding from her shoulder. Shadows snapped at the rest, knocking them off course. "He's worse than Karis," Escher grumbled beside Cal and raised his hand. When he closed it into a fist, 3 demons went down, violently convulsing and foaming at the mouth. Escher leaned forwards and exhaled hard. While his brother loved to use his command over water to explode demon hearts, it took its toll on him and required a great amount of strength. It didn't stop Escher from lifting his head and sending another 4 demons to the ground. "Dial it back," Diamond snapped. "I can't protect you and close this gate. These goddesses are stronger than I anticipated. They're fighting me." "Fuck off," Escher barked. "I can handle it." 5 demons rushed Escher as he struggled to recover. Cal sent them plowing into their comrades with another blast of wind that ripped the arm off one of them. Escher shot him a black look that dared him to mention that he couldn't handle it and he'd had to save his ass. "Mari!" Cal hollered as she stepped backwards, evading the wraith's blade. "Can you help close that gate?" She didn't hesitate. She nodded, her beautiful face set in grim, determined lines as her violet gaze darted from him to the gate. The colors of it washed over her as the central purple disk flashed and another ring formed. The wraith's spell had faded thanks to Cass, but the gate was almost open. The power of it hummed in the air, echoed in his bones, and he drew on it, using it to bolster his strength. He was going to need it. Cass attacked the wraith head-on, hitting him with a blast of magic that singed his coat, and had him tumbling across the flagstones, leaving a trail of smoke and embers in his wake. Maybe having the witch on their side wasn't such a bad thing. Her ice-blue eyes shot to Diamond as he grunted. Cal's gaze leaped to his brother, too. A shadow twisted around Diamond's leg, had ripped through his long black coat and cut into his black jeans. Cal hurled a blast of air at the Necromancer, hoping it would distract him enough that Diamond could break free of the shadows. Cass went one better. Fist-sized orbs of fire shot down from the sky like a meteor shower, shaking the ground as they struck it, and filling the night with the shrieks and bellows of the demons unfortunate enough to be hit by one and survive the blow. The Necromancer shot forwards, as swift as his shadows had been as he dodged each fireball, moving so fast it looked as if he was appearing and disappearing. "Cass!" Miranda cried. The rain of fire ceased as Cass switched her focus back to Miranda. Cal growled and broke away from Escher, throwing himself into the wall of demons between him and Miranda, as the wraith lifted her feet off the ground, his grip on her throat tightening. "Mari!" he breathed and fought the demons as they crowded him, punching and kicking, using his power to fuel each blow so they were deadly. More demons poured in to fill the gaps. The Necromancer. He must have ordered them to shore up the wall between him and the wraith, slowing him down. The gate flashed again as Miranda struggled. The wave of power that washed over him had his stomach sinking. The gate was open. He focused on it, but he couldn't convince it to close. Half of the demons launched at it, lashing out at the rings. They blackened wherever the demons touched them, sparking violently. He had to stop them. "Cass!" He pointed to the demons. "Get them off! No, don't! Help Miranda!" He couldn't risk Cass's magic damaging the gate. The demons were aggravating it, but the damage they were doing was minimal, caused by it reacting to them. Cass's magic was strong. If she attacked the demons, there was a chance she would harm the gate, too. Things hadn't ended well when Karis had accidentally damaged the twin gate in Seville. Cal had been forced to seal it, shutting it down entirely, and it had taken a lot of blood and several days to recover from the ordeal. He couldn't imagine how long it would take Ares to recover if he had to seal the Paris gate. "Get them out of here!" The Necromancer. Cal's eyes shot wide when he realized the Hellspawn was talking to the Wraith. A portal formed behind Eli, the dark cloud boiling outwards, violet and green lightning chasing across it as it expanded. He couldn't let Eli take Miranda. If the Wraith got her through the portal, Cal might never see her again. Several demons between him and Miranda dropped, grunting as they hit the pavement and then exploded, showering the other demons in foul black blood. Escher snarled as he ripped at others with his claws, rending flesh and spilling more blood, his face a black mask as his eyes remained locked on the Wraith. His brother wanted payback too, had a personal beef with Eli. Cal used that to his advantage, working beside him to fight through the wall of demons. Portals formed to his left and right, more of the wretches pouring through them to shore up their numbers. "Gods damn it!" he growled and looked to Diamond. Diamond was fighting the Necromancer, using walls of ice to block the shadows the male kept throwing at him, keeping the Hellspawn busy, buying Cal time to reach Miranda. "Fuck!" Escher bit out as one of the Irines leaped into the portal nearest Eli. Cal was about to step when Miranda clamped both hands down on the Wraith's wrists and the portal behind Eli started to close. She was siphoning the demon's power. Eli released her throat and tried to get her hands off him, but she held on, her violet eyes narrowing and glowing brighter. The wraith slammed a fist into the side of her head, knocking it to her right, and she grunted, shook off the blow as she released one of his wrists and hit him with a punch of her own. His head tipped backwards as her fist cracked against his nose. Black poured from it, and Eli bared his fangs. Cal summoned the air, gathering it above the demons and fighting the drain on his strength, forcing himself to keep going. He unleashed it in a devastating sweep that sent them all flying, tumbling out of the way. Escher launched for the wraith, his claws growing as he barreled towards the male. The second Erinyes dived through the shrinking portal just before it closed and disappeared. Eli backhanded Miranda and she cried out, the sound tearing at Cal's heart as she slammed into the ground and bounced across it. He changed direction, rushing to check on her. She was already pushing onto her feet by the time he reached her. Diamond suddenly flew between them, crashed into Cass, and sent her flying over the edge of the hill with him. "Go!" the Necromancer barked. Cal's gaze leaped to Eli. A portal started to form again. On a vicious snarl, Miranda shot past Cal. She kicked off, cracking the flagstones, and leaped at Eli. The male didn't have a chance to brace himself. Miranda slammed into him, knocking him down, and the portal closed again as she seized his throat and pinned him to the ground. The Necromancer appeared beside her, grabbed her by her nape, and hauled her off the wraith. He lifted her before him, glared at her, and hurled her. Cal's heart lodged in his throat as she sailed towards him. He pressed down with his boot and launched upwards, realized he wouldn't be able to jump high enough, and stepped to intercept her. He caught her and stepped again, landed a short distance from the gate, and sank to his knees.
"Cal?"
Miranda's soft voice and the gentle touch of her palms against his cheeks had him nodding, trying to show her that he was fine. The drain on his strength was temporary, but if they didn't end this soon, it would take him longer to recover, and that would leave him open to attack. Diamond reappeared, a very angry Cass in tow. She muttered things at his brother as she swept ice flakes from her black dress. Ice flakes that looked a hell of a lot like handprints on her waist. His white-haired brother didn't look at all apologetic about where he had chosen to hold her during the teleport. In fact, Diamond's blue eyes were bright, flecked with white, and his pupils were dark pools. If Cal had to name that look, he would call it hunger. Beyond Diamond and Cass, Karis appeared in a swirl of black. The second his oldest brother touched down, shadows raced across the pale ground, shooting towards the demons. Screams filled the air, monstrous shrieks that pierced Cal's ears as the wretches went down, frantically clawing and trying to escape Karis's shadows. The Necromancer flicked Karis a glare. In a battle of shadows, Cal wasn't sure who would win. Valen landed in a blazing flash of lightning that struck outwards across the terrace, hitting several demons. They exploded, and Cal pulled Miranda close to him and twisted, shielding her with his body as pieces of demon hit him. "What did I miss?" Valen grinned at him as Cal scowled in his direction, a split in his lip opening. His violet-haired brother reached under his left arm, grabbed two small throwing knives, and casually tossed them without looking. They both hit their target, sparking with lightning as they embedded between the eyes of two demons who had been rushing towards him. "I'm certainly getting a workout tonight." His golden eyes glowed, the dark bruising around his left one only making it appear even brighter. Overhead, thunder rumbled. Rain lashed down. "Keep them busy," Karis barked, and everyone rushed to obey that order, leaving him to deal with the gate. Diamond, Cass, and Valen went after the demons. Escher was still trying to get close to the wraith. Whenever he managed to get near him, shadows drove him back. His brother was right to be wary of them. Cal pushed to his feet. Miranda looked up into his eyes, her black-ringed violet ones filled with malice, a hunger that had him shaking his head. She didn't give him a chance to tell her not to do it. She shot past him and yelled a battle cry that got the attention of her target. The Necromancer looked at her, his golden eyes shining as he slowly smiled. He wanted her to try to fight him, because he wanted a chance to get his hands on her. Two of the Erinyes had escaped. The Necromancer just needed to get hold of Miranda, and he would have all three of them. She sprinted past Escher, who watched her go, and the shadows the Necromancer had been using parted to allow her through. His brother tried to follow, but the shadows closed behind her and snapped at him, forcing him back. Escher growled low and stepped. Crazy bastard. Cal stepped with him the second he realized what he was going to do, and that Miranda would probably kill the Necromancer if he didn't stop her. Cal had been all for that before, when it had looked like the only choice he had, but now his brothers were here. There was a chance they could capture the Necromancer and get the location of Calindria's soul from him. Cal landed behind the Necromancer as Miranda ran at him, keeping his focus ahead of him, leaving his back wide open. "Go, now!" The Necromancer tossed a look at Eli. Eli slashed at Escher with his blade, driving his brother away, and nodded. Rather than attempting to form another portal, Eli broke right, running for the gate. Escher's eyes blazed crimson and narrowed as he roared, the sound pure fury as it rocked the night. "No!" Diamond bellowed and stepped, appearing behind Escher a split second too late to grab him. Escher was already racing after the demon. "Close the gate!" Cal hollered. Karras's face darkened, and he held both hands out in front of him, but nothing happened. "It's resisting me." Had the Irines done something to it? "Escher, don't!" Diamond stepped in front of Escher just as the wraith leaped to the gate. Escher swept his right arm out and hit Diamond with a backhand that sent him shooting across the square. Cal lunged for Escher, unable to believe what he had just done. Escher gave him a cold look, one that stopped him dead. That wasn't his brother. That was the other Escher, the one driven by a need to hunt, to kill. Nothing Cal or any of his brothers could say would reach him, and he would fight them all if they tried to stop him. He felt cold, useless as Escher leaped into the gate. "No!" Diamond breathed as he appeared next to Cal. His ice-white eyes locked on Cal's. "You should have stopped him." "There was no stopping him, and you know that," Cal countered, squaring up to him, aware his brother was hurting, fearing for Escher just as he was, and that was the reason he had lashed out. Escher had crossed through the gate without an amulet to protect him from the gatekeeper on the other side, and against the wishes of their father. This was Cal's fault. He should have messaged everyone and woken Escher before rushing after Miranda. He should have waited for his brothers before he had attacked the enemy. He should have done 1,000 things differently. He couldn't let Escher go after the wraith alone. "I can get him back." Cal jerked back as someone seized his arm. Karras looked down at him and solemnly shook his head. "Let him go. He'll return to us when he's ready." If he survived the hunt and the underworld. A bright blue burst of light off to his left had his head whipping that way. Miranda nimbly dodged the shadows that shot from the ground, driving her away from the Necromancer. Another flash of light had half of a shadow figure melting away, only for it to reconstruct itself. Cass launched another attack at it. The twisting orb shot straight past the figure as it shifted left, curved around and came back at it. It hit the shadow in the back, blasting right through its head. The Necromancer grunted, swept his hand forwards. Demons rushed Miranda and Cass. Diamond launched into the fray, great spears of ice rising from the ground as the rain hit it, impaling the less fortunate demons. Karras turned dark eyes on the Necromancer, and Cal was with him as Valen joined the fight, providing backup for Diamond, striking down demons in blazes of white-purple lightning. "We need him alive." Karras didn't need to tell Cal that, but someone did need to tell Miranda. She leaped clear over the demons, brought her feet down, and aimed them at the Necromancer's chest. He dodged backwards, evading her, and she slammed into the ground in a crouch that shattered the flagstones. She was quick to push up onto her feet, a black snarl peeling from her lips as her nails transformed into claws.
"You killed my father,"
she growled, her voice laced with pain and fury, with that need for vengeance that shone in her eyes. "Mari!" he called, hoping to get through to her even when he knew that was impossible. The hunger for revenge drove her now, had her fury side firmly in control. He could tell by how swiftly she moved as she ducked and swept left and right, dodging the shadows that tried to seize hold of her, too fast for them. She slammed the back of her heel into the Necromancer's head, knocking him off balance. The moment her foot touched down, she launched a kick with her other one, catching the male in his shoulder, tipping him further off balance. He staggered sideways, shaking off the blows. "You belong with me," he snarled back at her. She tackled him head-on, her fists a blur. The Necromancer blocked most of her punches but made no move to hit her back. He wanted to capture her. With the other two Irines at his disposal, able to open the gates, he didn't need her. She would make them stronger, but she would also prove troublesome. There was no way the necromancer would be able to control this side of her, no way she would ever calmly do his bidding. The male's golden eyes narrowed on her.
You need to accept I'm your father.
Shit. That explained why she had gone nuclear. The hellspawn had dropped a bomb on her, and it had shaken her, probably filled her head with 1,000 doubts that had been chewing away at her all this time they had been fighting.
I don't. You're not. Eric was my father.
Her voice wavered.
You're not.
She didn't believe that. Eric might have been the one who had raised her and taken care of her, but some part of her had accepted that this male had sired her. A part of her that didn't like it, judging by how fiercely she attacked him. Her claws raked over his shoulders, slicing through his black shirt, and a flash of victory shone in her eyes as she hurled a right hook at his chest. She meant to punch a hole through it. It would kill him.
Mari!
Cal kicked off and then stepped, the need to stop her sending him into the teleport before he could hold it back. His legs gave out as he hit the ground on the other side of the necromancer, and he could only watch as the male calmly blocked her blow with the flat of his hand, captured her fist, and twisted. He slammed her into the ground so hard that her impact caused a crater and she cried out, and then went dreadfully still. No.
You should have come quietly.
The necromancer looked down at her as violet-black shadows billowed outwards in the air behind him, sparked with purple light that sent a chill sliding down Cal's spine. A portal. The other Irines had siphoned the power from Eli, too. The necromancer picked Miranda's prone form up and rested her over his right shoulder. Everything inside Cal screamed at him to stop the male as he turned towards the forming portal. He couldn't lose Miranda. He just couldn't. Beyond the necromancer, his brothers and Cass continued their fight against the horde of demons. They wouldn't reach Miranda in time. Darkness surged through his tired body, had his focus locking on the hellspawn as the male slowly shifted his gaze to land on him. A cold smile curled his lips, a victorious smile. On a feral snarl, the darkness consumed Cal, had his arm sweeping forwards, the air gathering in its wake. The male wouldn't take Miranda from him, not as he had taken Calendria. Cal wouldn't let him. He was stronger now, and he protected what was his. The air that followed his arm compressed as he applied pressure, becoming a razor-thin invisible blade that he unleashed as he lifted his hand. As the male took a step forwards towards the portal, Cal silently apologized to his sister. It was her or Miranda, and he needed Miranda. She made him whole again, gave him a reason to live and keep on fighting. As the blade of air cut upwards and the necromancer halted, Cal made a promise. Together they would find Calendria's soul, even if it took forever. A red line formed at a diagonal from the necromancer's left biceps to a point above his right eye. The male slumped, the two pieces of him separating as he fell forwards. Miranda tumbled from his grip, and Cal crawled to her as the demons scattered, as the light from the gate faded as Karis finally managed to close it. As the heat of the battle subsided, cold stole through Cal. What had he done? The necromancer was dead, his one shot at discovering the location of his sister's soul gone with him, and suddenly the fact he might never see her again felt all too real. He pulled Miranda into his arms and held her, cradling her to his chest as his heart grew heavy, and tears burned the backs of his eyes. She was safe. He looked at the dead hellspawn, but could he say the same for his sister? He prayed to the Moirai to be kind for once, to let his sister's soul be somewhere safe, somewhere free of torment and danger, and to keep it that way until he could find her, because he would find her. His brothers came to him, grave looks on all their faces that told him he wasn't alone in what he was feeling, but none of them shouted at him as he had expected. Karis crouched before him, warmth in his green eyes for once. You did what you had to do. But that didn't make it any easier on him. He had forsaken his sister. Diamond came to stand over him, and Cal looked up at him, surprised to find warmth in his blue eyes, too. Belief that stirred something similar inside Cal as he spoke. Escher will find the Wraith. You can count on that. Our brothers never failed in a hunt. Diamond ghosted a hand over Cal's shoulder. He will bring the demon back with him. Which means we will find her, Valen put in. even if we have to get a little help from our uncle. Father will help too, Karis said. Cal nodded. He was sure of that. But there were regions of the underworld and Olympus where Hades and Zeus couldn't see. It would take time for the legions to scout them, searching every inch of the lands for Calendria's soul. Time in which she would be alone and unprotected, vulnerable. Miranda's nose wrinkled and her eyelids fluttered, and he breathed a little easier. Her blue eyes opened, sorrow washing across them, telling him she knew what he had done for her sake, and then resolve filled them. Her hand lifted and pressed to his cheek, and he stared down at her.
My father told me something once.
Her soft words were quiet, hoarse, a reminder that she needed healing. She smiled for him.
Have faith when times are tough, and be strong.
He pulled down a slow breath. He could do both of those things, or at least he would try. His sister wouldn't want him to be sad, to drown in the fear that she was forever lost to him now, and he had failed her again. She would want him to have faith, to be strong. So he would have faith. Escher would find Eli and his brother would bring him to them. And then he would be strong. He would break the wraith, wouldn't stop until Eli told him where his sister's soul was. And then he would save her, too. Chapter 35. Everyone was quiet as they appeared one by one in the Tokyo mansion, a shadow hanging over them. Aiko came in from the garden, a bounce in her step that faltered as she locked gazes with Diamond. Her dark eyes widened, her face falling as she shook her head. Her brow furrowed and her hand covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Diamond was quick to go to her, frowned as he hovered his hands near her shoulders. He's fine. Eli made it through the gate. Aiko sank to her knees and burst into tears. Diamond kneeled beside her, a lost look on his face, tears welling in his eyes as he husked. He'll come back. He will come back. He has to come back. Aiko leaned over, curling into herself as she sobbed, and Diamond sagged, as if all his strength and his hope had just washed from him, too. He'll come back, Karis said, his deep voice filled with the belief that Diamond lacked right now. It was understandable. Diamond was close to Escher, the two sharing a bond that had started out strong and had only grown stronger over the years. The sort of bond that Cal had once shared with his sister. Cass took Miranda from him and sat her down near the dining table to his left, leaving him standing there alone in the middle of the room, the weight of everything that had happened pressing heavily on his shoulders. It's not your fault. Valen clamped a hand down on his shoulder. Escher is stubborn. Nothing you could have done would have stopped him, not when that side of him is in control. I know that, he murmured, but I still feel as if I should have tried. He would have hurt you, Diamond whispered as he sat near Aiko, a torn look on his face as his hand ghosted over her back. Pain filled his blue eyes, not only pain caused by his worrying about Escher, but pain caused by the fact he wanted to comfort Aiko and hold her, and he couldn't, not without hurting her. I'll stay here until he comes back. He'll come back. Those last three words lacked conviction, sounded more like a plea for reassurance as he glanced up at Karis. Karis nodded. He will. I'll send messengers to father and uncle directly. Do not lose faith, either of you. Cal's big brother looked from Diamond to him. Cal forced himself to nod, even when he wasn't sure he could hold on to the delicate threads of his hope. They already felt as if they were wearing away. I'll go get some things. Diamond disappeared. Cass glanced at where he had been, a flicker of concern in her pale blue eyes. Was she worried about his brother? Valen gently helped Aiko onto her feet, brusquely muttering, Escher will be back, and causing us more trouble again before we know it. She nodded, her dark hair falling down around her face as she scrubbed her eyes. Cal watched as his brother led her away, down the corridor that led to Escher's room over the koi pond. This place wasn't going to be the same until Escher was back. Nothing was going to be the same until then. Karis came to him, lifted a hand, and squeezed his shoulder. You did the right thing. His brother could tell him that as many times as he wanted, It didn't change the fact he had just killed their one good shot at finding the location of their sister's soul. He glanced at Miranda as Karis disappeared. His heart whispered that he had done the right thing. He had fallen apart when Calendria had died. If he lost Miranda, well, it didn't bear thinking about. He wouldn't survive that. He would have changed, just as Escher had done all those centuries ago. The darker side of their blood, the fiercely protective and possessive side, had grown to become another side of his brother, splitting his personality into the slightly crazed Escher and the violent, unpredictable, and savage one. Cal would have ended up the same if the Necromancer had taken Miranda from him. The darker part of him had already been pushed too hard by his torture at the Necromancer's hands when he had been young and vulnerable, and by watching his sister being put through hell and then murdered. He wouldn't be able to resist it if something catastrophic happened to Miranda, or any of his family. He could still hear Aiko crying, each sob tearing at his heart. He looked down at his forearm and the blue script that tracked up it, the language of the underworld. He wanted to use it. He wanted to bring his brother back to them. He had the power to enter the underworld and go after him. He had to do it. So why was he still standing in the middle of the main room of the mansion? Why couldn't he bring himself to be reckless and live up to the expectations of his brothers? He was sure they all thought he would use his favor mark to go after Escher. He glanced at Miranda, and the answer hit him. He didn't want her to cry for him the way Aiko was crying for his brother. He didn't want to put her through that, to make her hurt like that. She had been hurt enough for a lifetime, was still hurting judging by her haunted eyes. Cass helped Miranda onto her feet. Miranda said something to her, brushed off her hand, and walked away, heading towards the garden as she wrapped her arms around herself.
I think she needs a moment,
Cass said when Cal looked her way. Didn't they all? But the moment he needed was with Miranda. He needed to hold her and have her reassure him that he had made the right decision, that everything would work out. He needed to hold her and make her see that whatever thoughts were filling her head, they were wrong. This wasn't her fault. This wasn't the end. He trailed after her, weaving his way across the stepping stones that snaked across the gravel in the courtyard of the house, passing the elegantly clipped topiary. He brushed his fingers over the neat green balls of leaves that topped the twisted stems, a hollow feeling opening inside him. They would look like hell by the time Escher returned. He would have to take care of them for his brother. He wouldn't be alone either. He was sure of that. Everyone would do their best to keep this place as it was now, awaiting Escher's return. He sensed Ares appear in the house behind him and heard Megan say something about Aiko. It was good of her to come to comfort Aiko, to be there for her. Cal couldn't imagine what sort of job Valen was doing of cheering her up and giving her hope. Cal found Miranda on the vermilion wooden bridge that spanned part of the koi pond, her eyes on the water. She sucked down a shuddering breath as he approached her, and when he stopped next to her, she refused to look at him. She kept her head bent, her focus on the fish that swam beneath her. Aiko would take care of them. They were precious to Escher. Miranda sniffled. Cal placed his arm around her shoulders. She jerked backwards, dislodging him. He frowned at her, his irritation swiftly fading as a tear tracked down her cheek, cutting through the dirt and catching the sunlight. He tried again, this time refusing to release her when she attempted to break free. He curled his hand around her shoulder and pulled her to his side, tucked her there and held her. She wanted to be alone, but it wasn't what she needed. He had been in her shoes more times than he could count. It had taken him a long time to realize that pushing everyone away wasn't the answer, and being alone wasn't the solution to anything. In the end, it only ever made him feel worse. It only ever gave his darker feelings a stronger hold over him.
I'm sorry,
she whispered, and scrubbed the heel of her hand across her eyes.
Everything is ruined because of me.
No, it isn't. He knew she couldn't see the light right now. Even he found it difficult to see it through all the darkness that surrounded him. But it was there. She spun free of his grip and faced him, pain in her blue eyes as they locked with his, and she bit out,
This is all my fault, Cal. Don't tell me it isn't. I was stupid, weak. I let my rage get the better of me when I should have controlled it. And look where it got us. The Iranians have the power to open the gates. The wraith escaped. Your brother is missing, and your sister's soul.
We'll find her soul. He lifted his hand and grasped both of her shoulders, held her in place when she looked as if she wanted to fight him. My brother will find the wraith. When that side of him is in control, he's a formidable hunter. The wraith won't be able to hide from him. I don't know how long it will take, but he'll find him and he'll bring him to us. I'm sure of it. She didn't look convinced. Cal raised his right hand and cupped her cheek. I'm sure of it, Mari. But if he isn't back in a few weeks, I'll speak with the others about using my ability to cast a portal. I'll go in search of him. That had the opposite effect to the one he anticipated. Instead of looking comforted, her eyes widened, a wildness in them as she launched forwards and grabbed his arms.
Don't go there,
she murmured, pleading him with her eyes as her brow furrowed. He couldn't promise that. I'll wait and give him time, but I will go looking for him if he doesn't come back. I have to, Mari. If it comes to it, I'll be careful.
I'll go with you,
she blurted, the first flicker of determination entering her eyes, brightening them and chasing some of the shadows away.
We'll go together.
Her face fell again.
The gates.
She averted her gaze, fixing it back on the colorful fish. Cal wrapped his arms around her and pressed a kiss to her hair. We'll close as many of them as we can. It won't be easy, but we'll do it. We'll protect them from the other Irines. Besides, they're weaker without you. There's a chance they might not be strong enough to open them. She shuffled closer to him and started to relax. He rubbed her back, trying to buoy her up, and lift his heart at the same time. He looked off to his left to the horizon. The other world flickered over the present. Gold sparks danced high into the red sky, billowing from the fires that ravaged the ruined buildings, but there were no screams of mortals or piercing shrieks of demons on the hunt. It felt as if they had been dealt a blow tonight, but the other world said differently.
What do you see?
Miranda's voice trembled with nerves, but it was stronger now, brighter. It looks better than before. He clung to that as fiercely as he clung to Miranda. She gave him a skeptical look. He frowned down at her. I wouldn't lie to you. It does look better. We're all hurting right now, but we dealt the enemy a blow today. They lost a powerful ally. And before you know it, Escher will be back, dragging Eli kicking and screaming behind him.
And we're growing stronger.
Miranda's words strengthened his hope. The steely resolve that shone in her eyes told him that she had meant what she had said about coming with him to find Escher, and that she meant what she said next.
I'm in this fight now, and so is Cass. If the Irines attack the gates, I'll be there to stop them.
Cal smoothed his hand over her cheek and tilted her head back, stared down into her eyes, and didn't resist the warmth that spread through him, the feelings he had never wanted but now didn't want to live without. We'll be there to stop them. He dipped his head and captured her lips, kissed her softly, savoring it and the feel of her in his arms. Just as we'll find my sister's soul. It's free now. We freed it. We'll find it. Miranda swept her lips across his and then drew back, her eyes lifting to his.
Would Thanatos be able to help?
Why hadn't he thought of that? Thanatos was the god of death. He might be able to see what happened to souls before Cal's father took control of them to assign them to their final resting place. It's worth a shot, but you're staying here if I go and speak with him. He weathered her glare and shook his head. I saw the way he looked at you.
Jealous?
She sidled closer and pressed her palms to his chest. Jealous? No. Liable to fly into a murderous rage if someone hits on the woman I love? Hell yes. Miranda's tropical eyes slowly widened. Was it something he had said?
Woman you love?
Her eyes searched his. He shrugged stiffly. Cat's out of the bag now. She cuffed him around the side of his head.
Be serious for once.
Her expression softened, making her even more beautiful, and making him irritatingly gooey inside. A 760-plus god that had spent his life as a warrior, had been honed in battle and shaped by darkness, shouldn't be melting over a woman. But he was. Now he understood how his brothers felt when they looked at their women, how his father felt whenever he softened around his mother. I might be in love with you, he muttered. He was definitely in love with her. She tiptoed and breathed against his lips.
I might be in love with you, too.
He growled low and gathered her to him, went to kiss her and frowned as she pressed a finger to his lips, stopping him. Her now violet eyes were deadly serious.
I will see to it that any woman who so much as looks at you the wrong way is served justice. And if you wrong me, if you look at another woman in a way I don't like, you'll know it.
He shivered. Not a bad sort. His prim little cellist had a wicked dark side that really revved his engine and made him purr for her. She pulled him in for a kiss that seared him right down to his soul and tattooed her name on his heart. I want forever with you, he whispered against her lips, his heart thundering, stomach somersaulting as he put that out there. Before she could speak, his damned mouth kept moving. But I need to fulfill my duty. I need to protect the gates, and I need to get my brother back and find my sister's soul. A long list that felt as if it was a barrier between him and the future he needed with her, the forever he needed with her. He wasn't sure how long it would take, and he feared it would be a problem for her. She was used to a quieter sort of life, and that's what he wanted to give her, what he would give to her if she put up with his craziness for a little while. She hit him with a killer smile that said it wasn't a barrier at all, and her words stole his heart all over again.
Our forever started the moment I met you. But you know what they say. The couple that slays together stays together.
Her eyes flashed violet. She took hold of his hand. Cal looked down at it and then at her. Forever with his little fury was going to be wild, unpredictable, and dangerous. But damn, he had a feeling it was going to be worth it. The end. This has been Calistos, Guardians of Hades Romance Series, Book 5, written by Felicity Heaton and narrated by Eric G. Dove. Copyright 2020 by Felicity Heaton. Production copyright 2020 by Felicity Heaton.